Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time. And 2020, not the most enjoyable year to say the least. I recall back to my Q&A in March, when the Nostradamus Opinion announced that the year seemed to be calming down, which in hindsight was a slightly misguided forecast. In fact, I'd positively say it was a kiss of death, as the world is careened towards its frankly well-deserved armageddon. I've honestly not handled it too well personally. To see so much going on makes me want to curl up in a ball and hibernate, or estivate if you consider when all this was happening. At the same time, there's always reason within the chaos, and I've always lived by the philosophy that I'd emerged from hardships a wiser man, and a part of me hopes that would be similarly applicable on a macro level as well. However, we'll never reach that if we can't have a proper, mature discussion to understand how such discord has arisen. And at times when emotions can run high, we often need voices of reason to lead that discourse forward, so that we can all learn from such adversities. In the past few years in particular, I feel that YouTube has become increasingly integral to that conversation, introducing a new generation to the many complex and sometimes not so complex matters facing down today's youth, with online creators engaging audiences through fresh mediums, acquainting them with new ideas and perspectives. Although the nature of my channel can be a little biographical, I hope that people have found value in the viewpoints I have to share. And you know what? I'd say the feedback has been broadly positive. One way that people recognize the work you do often is what some regard as year-end lists, where individuals compile a selection of their favorite creators and post it to their preferred social media site. At the end of 2019, I was once again honoured by being placed amongst YouTubers who put great effort into their respective hustle. However, one name whose presence I was surprised to see was a commentator by the name of Blaire White.
Oh hi, welcome back to my channel. So you guys are currently in bed with me, which not a lot of people can say because I am very innocent.
Blaire White is a creator who has been on the platform for a good few years and has spent her time mostly preoccupied with socio-political commentary. She presents her perspective from quite a unique angle, espousing conservative-leaning narratives which wouldn't be too exceptional on paper, but is somewhat intriguing when you juxtapose this ideology with the fact that Blaire is transgender.
A lot of the times on this channel and on my social media, I'm presenting a sort of side to the trans topic that not many people are used to seeing. I don't talk about things in the way that every single other trans influencer in the world talks about. I don't talk about things in the way that every other trans activist you've ever seen talks about them. I am different.
These two positions aren't entirely incompatible. When considering that the doctrine of social conservatism in particular has often been quite hostile to LGBT rights, it would seem that adopting this outlook would be counterintuitive for anyone of that demographic's denomination. However, with young Republicans and conservatives seeming to be more amenable to pro-LGBT policy, the setting of an online platform aimed at a younger, more broad-minded audience could not be more alluring to those who may find themselves set apart from their stereotypes by their beliefs, identity, or in this instance even, both. Since launching her channel in 2016, Blaire had amassed over 1 million subscribers, garnering a dedicated fanbase eager to see her tackle subjects which can often be highly consequential for the parties involved. In many ways, her personal experience as a transgender individual allowed her to provide a new energy to previously archaic conservative narratives that were often weighed down by their inherent lack of empathy for the individuals at the heart of the discussion, while also correcting misconceptions that had previously been peddled about Blaire and many of her peers. To those who admired her, and perhaps to Blaire herself, White was a bridge between previously estranged communities who on the surface had very little in common. However, unlike some political commentators who have sprung up in the last few years, Blaire was never exactly renowned for her diplomatic demeanor.
If you're trans, you don't have the right to share an opinion like this, for which I actually quote tweeted them and said, "I'm trans, idiots." They criticized me for being a trans medicalist, which is me believing that being trans is a medical issue because that's exactly what it is. And just really mad that I don't think non-binary people are the same thing as trans. Too bad, too sad. Whatever.
In fact, from my perspective, she had been a divisive figure from since I could remember, and therefore when seeing her alongside a fair few mild-mannered creators, I was surprised. Now, I don't follow too many commentators outside my sphere, but I stay in the loop with all the current affairs, and it was intriguing that someone who I knew for being moderately contentious among communities, to put it mildly, had won over the hearts of those who would typically steer clear of that brand of content. However, I decided not to investigate further because it wasn't really of much concern to me. If she was making content that went down with a wider spectrum of viewers, then good for her. Nonetheless, there was this lingering expectation in the back of my head this may not be the last that I hear from her, given that she was still outspoken on many issues, some of which would put her into conflict with some of her audience. Yet, she may well have evolved, and in her videos, she definitely seemed to purport herself as a reasonable medium.
No, there are normal trans people out there who don't believe all these radical things. And why don't those trans people get a voice? You know, there's so many people who talk about how like every trans story needs to be heard and we have to listen to trans people and blah, blah, blah. And like, cool, that's great. But why is it only on your terms? Why is there one narrative? And if we don't follow it, then no, everyone should be heard but Blaire White. Like, what are we doing?
Moderation. It's an important facet in 2020, with the post-election landscape to dwell on, a president-elect who pledged to take the US back to some normality, yet a residual skepticism of real change, and polarized tension that seemed hard to palliate. Many of her fans would have argued that Blaire's place could not have been more essential in healing the wounds that so many had sustained that year. Unfortunately, although some may have longed for her wisdom in this critical time, it was instead about to be the subject of an investigation, which, provoked by an avoidable incident, would drag much of her past back into light, and bring into question that self-acclaimed reputation of a reasonable, rational, and logical voice amongst all the havoc, with former fans and foes asking if actually she had been the instigator of this havoc all along.
I have thousands of people write to me every single day that they are so disgusted with the way that trans people are portrayed in the media, all because this is how trans activists and the more radical people on the end of the spectrum are dictating it be portrayed.
Well, to answer that curious query, I suppose it's about time we take a look for ourselves. And to do so, I'd like to go right back to 2015, where the Blaire White YouTube story all began. So if you care to join me on this journey, you'd be most welcome. Without further ado, let us commence. – 2015 YouTube. How does one characterize it?
I think that I found myself a cheerleader. Oh, I really wanna know.
Saying Sean King is white when he's white is incendiary. Christ menstruating with tits isn't incendiary.
Stir stuff up a little bit?
I'm here to ask questions, and it seems like you guys aren't very open to them.
For many years, YouTube had been the platform dominated by creators who didn't appear to take themselves too seriously. However, this had been gradually evolving, and by the end of 2015, this transformation was mostly complete. Now, there were still entertainers galore, but a more prominent role had been occupied by a political clique known to some as the Skeptics, that I'd acquired from their responses to eccentric religious zealots. Some of the creators in the community were more light-hearted in their narratives, merely mocking their subjects and providing casual repouts, while others tended to attack the specific fabric of arguments quite aggressively, even being quite provocative themselves.
If we come from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? And who is giving them markers and pieces of paper to write on?
In spite of this, by the present year, many YouTubers in this field were also referred to as anti-SJWs, an acronym for Social Justice Warrior, because they had shifted their focus towards other targets, many of whom were treated with absurdity or incredulity, either in their arguments or their attitudes. Now, not all skeptics went on to be anti-SJWs, and some in fact became very critical of that movement. However, this movement also seemed to broadly merge with creators who had not necessarily made anti-creationist content prior, some of whom gamers, others just casual creators turned commentators, mobilized by incidents such as the infamous Gamergate, or just general antics that they felt were worth calling out.
Over professional goals, thus minimizing their earning potential as their traditional marriages end. The assumption I'm reading.
The Social Justice Warrior was an infamous nemesis back in the tumultuous year, and for many online it was not hard to see why. They were generally not the most personable individuals, often presenting their somewhat radical ideas in a rather disagreeable fashion, and this subsequently made them quite easy prey for the enlightened commentator who would regularly descend from the heavens to put the halfwits in their place. I even dabbled in it here and there myself, though that year I must say I had more pressing matters to attend to.
What I do understand is that Jeremy Hunt is not qualified to run the NHS. His approval rating lies at 17%. 17 fucking percent. Fantastic Four has a better public rating. Fantastic fucking Four.
Damn, I really put those politicians in their place. Anyhow, turning back to this genre of creators, in reflection, it's very easy to look back at that social zeitgeist in a sneering fashion, but there were many who were very invested from a variety of political factions, because at the time I feel that what a lot of these self-proclaimed advocates of social justice represented to these creators and audiences alike was an attack on an internet culture quite sacred at the time, and one heavily exhibited in a variety of content, the sort of edge without any real weight behind it.
I will see how it goes after a week. Can we do next promotion?
Hell yeah, yellow
At the same time, it's important not to undersell the level of political engagement in a lot of these videos. There was a lot more at stake than just what happened online, and a lot more depth to the discourse, particularly contained within a multitude of social issues which had seeped onto the platform as tensions in the real world appeared to be rising with the impending plebiscites. It was an exciting time to be a creator in that genre, and more people wanted to be involved, one of those being our fabled title character. At this moment, Blaire was a computer science student at the California State University Chico campus. However, she was not having the most fun with her life, feeling a bit outcast by her identity, a transgender yet conservative-leaning individual, a stark contrast to many of her liberal professors and fellow students. Like many others in such a position, Miss White found more home in the online sphere, a place that she likely felt was more accommodating towards her beliefs and attitudes. In many ways, the online world had provided a protective enclave for a variety of identities, especially those that may face ostracism in real life. This was merely another branch of that outlet. Who knows exactly when she decided to become a YouTuber, but a turning point appeared to be when she appeared on the stream with creator who we can assume to be Theron Meyer, based on the tweet and obviously based on the archive of the video. It seems that many people encouraged her to start uploading her own content, and not too long after her first video was published.
Hello, my name is Blaire, for those of you who don't know, and in this video I'm going to be discussing a few related topics, one being feminism, the next being the men's rights movement, also the concepts of privilege, both male and female privilege, and just kind of my thoughts on all those things.
Now, Theron, whose stream Blaire had made the aforementioned appearance on, was a creator mostly focused around advocating for men's rights at the time, and therefore it made sense that Blaire's maiden video cover similar talking points. The upload in question is titled Female Privilege, and as the title implies, it seeks to observe various deficits in society, where women actually possess an advantage over their male counterparts, seemingly in contrast to many narratives disseminated by accredited institutes.
I've lived my life on both sides of the coin, per se, at different periods of my life. I think I definitely am in a position to critique the concept of privilege as it's perpetuated by feminist ideology. So there was a shift that happened in the way that the world interacted with me as I went further into my transition. Sort of the way that strangers interacted with me, the way I was treated, it all changed. It manifested in ways such as doors being held open for me, seats on public transportation being surrendered instantly, really. The term ladies first is definitely something that's actually implemented. It's not just a phrase.
However, Blaire also uses the video to express her own personal investments and experiences given her rather unique background in this dialogue. As a person who has transitioned, Blaire sees herself as someone who has encountered both sides of the gender coin, and thus also the privileges and drawbacks of constructs often bestowed onto such identities, implying this provides her with unique insight onto the topic, juxtaposing these differing experiences. She calls upon personal observations before sharing some hard-hitting statistics with her viewers.
The truth is that men make up 80% of suicides, nearly half of all domestic violence victims. More men in the US are raped, that is when you factor in prison statistics. 77% of homicide victims, 93% of workplace deaths, 88% of homeless individuals are male, and they're constantly screwed over in child custody and alimony cases.
This sort of content was hardly exceptional, mostly parroting core talking points made by a lot of its proponents. However, as a cornerstone for what her content was to become, it seemed to lay the framework quite nicely. Her tone, although stern, was not hostile. Her sources, occasional spelling error aside, are cited, and her production, although somewhat lacking, still allowed for content to be digestible. To be frank, a lot of political content back then consisted of an avatar that, if you were lucky, moved its arms up and down. So to have a fully expressive individual talking about these topics may have been considered a blessing to many.
These numbers definitely seem unfamiliar to most people. I know they definitely were to me when I started researching all of these things, but the reason they seem so unfamiliar and maybe even not so believable is because feminism does not even allow the conversation to be had.
As an upload, Blaire White's anti-feminist stance didn't tell us much about the world, but it did tell us a bit about Blaire. However, there was more to come, and first impressions can only tell us so much.
So those are my thoughts on the topics at hand, and I definitely want anyone who disagrees with me to comment, because I am open to people disagreeing with me. I like having my views challenged, and I am willing to change my mind if I'm proven wrong. So, bye.
Blaire's first upload was met with plaudits from many within the community that she was appealing to, particularly given her mostly forthcoming tone and open-minded outlook. Nonetheless, it was more than that, due to the previously expressed contrast of Blaire's gender identity with her political identity, and how she used it in discourse.
I am transgender, so that does affect the rate at which I may or may not experience violence. Violence does beget trans people at alarmingly high rates.
In a way, it dynamically flipped a narrative that had been traditionally associated with fairly progressive circles. The reference to how one's experience and identity can often shape their viewpoints, often being used as a stimulus to call for more diversity in certain intellectual circles. Here we had someone who represented that diverse upbringing, but whose ideological path had diverged from that which would be expected of someone who was stereotypically associated with her demographic. Many clearly welcomed this, though you may be justified in finding some people's enthusiasm a little nauseating. At the same time, as she acknowledges herself, she still passes as a cis woman in many spaces, so her perspective is somewhat different to that of other trans people who may be subjected to stigma relating to their appearance.
But I am lucky enough that I can enter most public spaces and the world does interact with me as a woman, not as a trans person or as a man.
Now, there were many criticisms that could be leveled towards her narratives, particularly given her tendency to conflate her specific experience as a woman with female experiences in general, an issue that would rear its head in future escapades. However, she didn't seem averse to criticism and still pointed towards clear systemic inequalities that should be addressed. As first videos go, it could be worse, and her next few videos followed a similar pattern.
He tells a story, and I don't remember exactly what his situation was, but basically his situation was worse than any girls in this class who talked about how their boyfriend used to verbally abuse them or used to hit them or used to grab them, whatever. Everyone in the class started laughing. Literally. I think the only person that didn't laugh was me and the instructor, the professor. And the truth is, you know, more women in the US are affected by domestic violence in terms of being victims. But it's something like over 40% are men. So it's not like it's 90-10 or 80-20. It's like 60-40. And I would venture to guess that it might even be closer to 50-50 if you take into account the fact that men don't talk about it. And when they do, they get laughed at.
Anecdotes interspersed with some factual information, often as a secondary feature. This isn't to her detriment, and there are many perceptible benefits to this, such as a more intimate relationship between the creator and their audience. But it also means there is a sense of trust that needs to be invested in the creator. For some people, that degree of trust needs to be earned, but if you're speaking to a believable experience that resonates with people, then the threshold is often lowered. So certain stories of institutional intolerance may hit closer to home for some individuals, particularly if it fits into their worldview. And back then, the idea of vicious, college-dwelling feminists who had it in for every cursed bloke who had ever set foot on Earth wasn't one that seemed far-fetched at all, especially with the prevailing narratives in many of these communities, substantiated by many, frankly, unflattering clips.
What? Humongous what? Humongous what? Humongous what? Humongous what? This person just spoke to me in a sexually harassing way.
I did not.
Yeah, he did.
Blaire's early output was definitely built on a somewhat personal connection between herself and the audience. This could also be reflected in the fact that her fourth video was a Q&A, surprisingly premature for a channel's lifespan, but she portrayed herself as an open book who felt comfortable divulging details about her life, which consequently commanded a lot of respect from her viewers. However, at the same time, this personal journey granted her with a lot of flexibility in the topics she could tackle, and with each subject she approached, we seemed to learn more about her and her curious opinions. Her videos were even structured in a way so that they would follow on previous theses, though this may alienate people who don't necessarily agree with her presuppositions, especially ones that kind of assume that she was correct, which wouldn't necessarily be the case.
So now that we're all in agreement that feminism is indeed cancer, let us take a look at the ways in which feminism is, like a virus, able to spread its misinformation, half-truths, blatant lies, and overall retardedness through the internet.
Oh, okay, I guess we established that then. The thing is that it's hard to go along with these assumptions when a lot of Blaire's points aren't the most ironclad. And to be brutally honest, Blaire's content didn't particularly stand out in the points that she made from a lot of other creators, sometimes falling quite short.
And it's true that women do have a higher pressure to look youthful and to stay young because we do value that in women within this culture. But, you know, that expectation is directly perpetuated by women. You know, the billion-dollar beauty industry, which is advertising anti-aging creams and Botox and things like that, those are largely ran by women, made for women. So if this meme is trying to imply that men are doing this to women, it's actually not true.
This is from a video titled Feminism is Pointless, though it was very charmingly titled Feminism is Cancer at one point, where Blaire reacts to a slew of memes that vary in their logical soundness, but also expose some of Blaire's internal biases, such as the one shown in that curious clip. Now, even if Blaire was correct in her assertion regarding industry leaders, it wouldn't necessarily be a valid response because the meme was a critique of society rather than men specifically, and it never asserted that men presently were the sole cause of harsher beauty standards that are often imposed onto women, an issue that Blaire acknowledges as existent right off the bat. Now, as noted, this is freshman content from our budding creator, so we can't expect everything to fall into place perfectly. I'm sure I and many other creators were hardly producing content of the highest order at this size, but it was symptomatic of that desire to prove a point, even when there wasn't one to be proven exactly.
So this one's cute. It's a picture of a feminist father wearing a shirt explaining that when it comes to dating his daughter, he doesn't make the rules and her daughter's boyfriend does not make the rules. So if you want to stick a blowtorch up his daughter's hole and tell her to pretend to be a Charmander, he's fine with that because it's her body.
Thank you for your contribution, Blaire. Yes, in spite of the personal tone and story shared, it feels like there is still a default back to a generic narrative employed by a lot of creators around that time.
So it's really frustrating to me that we live in a climate where there's all this discussion of gender politics, and these conversations often include things like manspreading and mansplaining and catcalling. And we have this huge elephant in the room, 80% of suicide victims being male, and we're not talking about it.
The hackneyed anyway feminism bad or strained whataboutisms. Sure, the number of men who take their own lives is undoubtedly alarming, but I don't know why that has to be compared to a discussion about catcalling, a behavior which I have to admit I personally find rather grotesque. This is an example of what was indeed a greater problem in the community at the time, but also one found on the channel, being that it felt like Blaire was drawn towards conclusions that would serve a specific agenda. This may have been a case of tunnel vision. When reviewing certain arguments, it becomes rather apparent.
You have to question the motive of a person who's willing to be abused, willing to stay in a bad situation, more than someone who's just a asshole who's gonna hurt someone regardless of who it is.
There had to be something more to Blaire, something that would elevate herself above the rote anti-SJW commentator. Well, there was. Her unique perspective and identity, right? Well, going off the first few videos, it was hard to exactly see how this influenced her worldview, but this was all about to change very soon.
You know, what are the ramifications of being called a hoe by 40 people? It'll affect your social life, probably. It's embarrassing, probably. But what are the ramifications of being accused of being a rapist?
You see, Blaire's video responding to the feminist memes was an interesting one in particular because it definitely showcased a capacity for her to be a bit more assertive. As stated, there was a mixture of tones in which creators addressed the subjects of their videos. In earlier uploads, whether you agreed with Blaire's conclusions or not, she didn't seem outwardly hostile. But this in particular seemed to be a pivot towards the combative content often tied to some of the edgier creators in the genre. At the same time, though, they were memes, and you could argue that she was at least mirroring the same energy that many of them emanated. It wasn't a typical Blaire White video. No. I think the video of interest comes a couple uploads later.
Hey guys, so one of the things people ask me about pretty often is my opinion on the sort of long list of arbitrary, obscure gender identities that exist out in the world.
Which video could this be? Maybe it's the one titled Trans Mentally Challenged. I will expand on why this is, though once again mostly serving as casual grounds for our channel's hostess to spew opinions on a hot topic, is also a very relevant video, as for the first time Blaire's opinion on many trans issues is coming to the forefront of her brand.
So yeah, I think all these identities are largely bullshit. I think they're super arbitrary. I think they're super meaningless. I think people who take them on are usually extremely boring and have nothing else to their personality other than I'm demi-queer, non-binary, gender special snowflake kin. And if you pay attention to these people, you'll notice that very rarely will you meet someone who identifies as one of these things who is not heavily involved in political activism to some extent.
In the video, she dismisses individuals who lie outside the traditional gender binary, makes some pretty generalized, presumptive comments about their status and motives for assuming such identities, and in general comes off as quite elitist.
These people are usually middle class, white, never had to struggle with anything in their life, but they want to call themselves this oppressed sexual gender minority as a means to silence any type of opposition they have in any type of political conversation. Because in our current political climate, oppression is a very valuable currency.
Now, I'm sure there are many responses one can formulate to her statements here, and comments that you and I are itching to make. But for now, I would like to put a pin on it, as I think we best keep an open mind and merely say that it serves as a good precedent for the content that was to follow. That rather noticeable distaste that Blaire seemed to possess for those who fell outside the acceptability range of traditional gender norms. Yes, and as I noted before, when approaching topics on previous discourse, even topics pertaining to gender like the upload before, she seemed reasonable. But this was a turn, and this persisted in uploads following as well. Not just in her tone, but in her attitude towards others. And I will elaborate here. I avoided explicitly mentioning the title of this upload as it's not a term I tend to indulge. However, back then it was more than commonplace. In spite of this acknowledgement, Blaire still weaponized it in a rather derogatory manner, and her subsequent uploads, although having more temperate titles, can often be found to have much more provocative captions at the time, thanks to Blaire's extremely professional thumbnails, and thanks to the archives. For example, feminist thinks all men are rapists, or triggering transgender people. Damn it, Blaire, you really love a good slur in the worst of contexts. I'd like to say she rectified these out of remorse, but given the fact that she's left offensive terms in other titles, I assume it was to try and stop YouTube from demonetizing or age restricting them. Because in other places she's changed them when there really was no offensive term, just a sensitive word, such as this one, where I assume racist obviously set off the YouTube alarm. So Blaire, in a state of pure indolence, changed the title to just minorities. But as amusing as that is, I will move on for now. As said, this era was a curious one for sure, particularly for the political community online. It was one where many felt free from the shackles that had bound them in real-life environments, and some clearly felt a catharsis in expressing themselves in a more unabashed manner. Nonetheless, I think some of these creators listened to a bit too much Ice Cube and drew the conclusion that a black person exclaiming the N-word on a rap track gave them license to start directing their decently sized platforms towards other creators, and barraging them with a slew of pretty relentless content, fortified by slurs that they felt more comfortable firing off due to their identity. This wasn't exclusive to Blaire. Theron, for example, was another person who engaged in similar antics. However, the fact that many of these comments or insults were often used in an exclusionary or alienating fashion against people who may have personal history with those words didn't really justify it.
So Kat Black's a YouTuber who's about as balls deep in Tumblr social justice as one could possibly get, and balls deep is appropriate because she's a trans.
100% comedy from Blaire White over here. You can tell that she would have surely become a stand-up if she had not pursued political commentary. But in a way where some may dismiss this as pointless edginess, critics would often see it as part of a greater ruse, which would be observed in other videos, with one garnering particular personal heat from myself. Yes, after making multiple response videos to contents that our queen had decreed as cringe, it seems that Miss White had her finger on the pulse of so many of those around her.
So today I want to talk about why people don't like trans. I've received thousands upon thousands of emails, comments, messages from people saying that before finding my channel, they had absolutely no understanding of trans people and that they were shocked to find a trans person who was actually sane.
In this lovely upload, once again amended to have a more restrained headline, she decides to discuss exactly what the public's problems are with the transgender community. Firstly, mentioning about her experiences with many people who previously weren't aware of the existence of sane transgender people until they encountered the wonders of Blaire White.
Because let's just face it, the majority of the ideas and policies and things that come out of the trans community and the activists that they prop up to speak for them in the public sphere are insane. I mean, I personally sometimes feel like I'm just drowning in this huge crowd of who are screaming and crying about 97 genders, and I'm just in the back like, I'm not one of them.
The transgender community then becomes this buzzword, and Blaire once more sets herself apart, affirming her opposition to Bill C-16, for example, the controversial Canadian one that saw the rise of Jordan Peterson. And in this, she also calls out the transgender community on other incidents, such as one where trans activists were allegedly pressuring the midwife community into using gender-neutral terminology, referencing an InfoWars article, which could have used a little research in itself, because most evidence appears to imply that there was little to no evidence of any pressure being applied at all. But okay, that's one reference. We'll put that aside for now. Her point is clear enough regardless.
But I'm sorry, like I said, acceptance is a two-way street, and behaving like insufferable children who place emotion-based arguments over fact-based arguments is not a way to get anything done.
There was a moment in time where Blaire White just wanted to grill. But that was no longer an option, and in taking a stand against these trans activists who were making all these unreasonable demands of society, she was proving that transgender people weren't this monolith that many had previously assumed them to be. But was anyone ever saying this, and was Blaire's narrative really as altruistic as it appeared to be?
Instead of arguing for the validity of transgenderism on a neurological or physiological level, you guys instead give up and start screaming and crying about how there's 97 genders. It's like, calm down, calm it down.
The examples covered in my previous part may have found Blaire approaching the aspects of trans issues from different angles, but they all seem to transport me back to the school playground in a way, and I'll explain why in a moment. The channel was always a very personal venture, and this upload was no exception, because although she proclaims that she is attempting to decipher the issue from within the community, she mostly uses it as a springboard to pat herself on the back and tell people who aren't like her to calm down.
And need I remind you that America and Western civilization in general is the pinnacle of safety and freedom for trans people. And by the way, that statement is actually true for every group of people under the sun. As a trans person, you can't step foot in a single Middle Eastern country without fear of being jailed or worse, and the same goes for pretty much every African country. In America, you have access to transgender medical care, the ability to legally amend your gender.
Fallacy of relative privation, Blaire. Basic bitch logic. Come on.
Is that I think there's a lot more people out there who are opposed to the batshit crazy ideas and policies that come out of the trans community and their activists rather than trans people themselves. Because let's just face it, the majority of the ideas and policies and things that come out of the trans community and the activists that they prop up to speak for them in the public sphere are insane.
I think it was tangible that at the time people had received an impression of leftism, or at least certain branches of leftism, due to chronicled attitudes of certain activists. However, to extend that logic to entire demographics and identity groups was ludicrous. All in all, it felt part of a greater narrative, which aside from being rather egotistical, like come on, you started your channel after appearing on stream with a transgender woman who espoused similar talking points at the time, it felt like an attempt to cater to people to win over their approval by being the quote cool transgender person. This may be impudent of me to say, but it felt like the goal of 2016 Blaire was her own acceptance rather than acceptance of the greater community. On Twitter and YouTube, she would present herself as the emissary, but I don't think the opposite could have been more true in a way. It felt like a playground where she was trying to fit in with a certain clique by ostracizing others, by proving that she was worthy, almost like initiation. In response to this, you could say that okay, the mainstream was a lot of the time the intolerant progressive lot, and maybe at her university it was. I'm happy to entertain that. But on YouTube it was a very different story, and once you take advantage of the power that you have to belittle others in your own domain, then you're no better than those you chastise so fervently. This can be embodied more than it is in the title, and once again, Blaire had initially and quite ironically used a slur in presenting why some people just don't really like transgender individuals. Now, some transgender individuals may be okay or comfortable with that, but many aren't, and already addressing a group of people in such a way is going to breed division and provocation. Really, you could make the argument that Blaire was validating using slurs in such a manner. That's only really going to win one side over and provoke the other, and when they are inevitably provoked, Blaire will just tell them to calm down again and high-five all her edgy friends. Having someone who set the bar so low for trans acceptance could make it easy for people to accept her and reject other trans people who in many ways weren't making unbelievably preposterous demands from those around them. And you could make the argument that those people were never going to accept other transgender individuals regardless, and that Blaire was at least making some level of acceptance somewhat accessible. Maybe she provided a ramp into the transgender community. I think this would be a somewhat valid response on the surface, and that in many ways, Blaire's position as a moderate could have been used to facilitate discourse between two separate camps, but this never fully materialized because she only aligned herself with the ideas of one of them, and Blaire never really made an effort to facilitate acceptance of people, sometimes quite the opposite. In fact, because her own bar of acceptance was high and sometimes rather uneven, and would lead one to wonder what sort of environment her own principles would lead to. Case in point, the following situation.
Would you date someone who's trans?
No.
Would you date someone who's black?
Maybe.
Would you date someone who's fat?
No.
Would you date someone who's disabled?
No.
One of the common recipients of Blaire White's responses was a creator by the name of Riley Dennis. She was known for her takes at the time, which many found contentious, particularly given the era where she posted a preponderance of her political opinions in. I have to admit that I disagreed with a lot of what she had to say at the time, and I still probably wouldn't align with a fair proportion of what she said then today. However, disagreement is a healthy constituent of academic discourse, and the online sphere should be fertile ground to nurture productive discussion. However, Blaire's demeanor towards Riley isn't what one would always characterize as, well, healthy. The first video released on Blaire's thoughts on trans special people is a response to a now-deleted Riley Dennis video, which asserts that feminism isn't about hating men, amongst many other things. At this point, Riley was identifying as a non-binary trans woman. However, throughout the video, Blaire refers to Riley as a he for reasons that are not explicitly clarified, but one can assume are in line with those expressed in the upload prior.
I can't believe it's 2016 and we still have to talk about this.
Okay, right off the bat, he's using the current year as an argument.
In another video where she contends Riley's assertion that misgendering is violence, Blaire generally avoids referring to Riley under any pronouns whatsoever, an option she probably thought was decidedly smarter given the topic. After concluding that misgendering is not violence but still a dick move, she takes the time to express her feelings on the matter of Riley's gender.
And Riley, you seem to be really upset that people don't refer to you as she everywhere you go, but can you really blame them? Like, honestly, you call yourself a woman and a trans woman, but you actively talk about how you won't take hormones. And hormone therapy and surgery in some cases are what's actually going to give you those secondary sex characteristics that allow people to visually perceive you as a woman, even if you are biologically male.
Now, her statements on what Riley said are completely false, but we'll cross that bridge soon. We have other antics to address first. In tweets around this time, Blaire was still taking more than enough liberties on labeling Riley under male pronouns, once more reaffirming her sentiments on the transition and proudly undermining any neutrality conveyed in that YouTube video. And a couple months later, Blaire returned back to using male pronouns in her upload. In spite of this, Blaire had also still used the heralded transgender slur in titles referring to Riley's uploads, which I find surprising if you didn't actually believe Riley to be transgender, really having your cake and eating it there. I have to say that I found what was flip-flopping at best and straight-up self-contradiction at worst, and some other things as well, rather confusing. Is this what bridging the gap looks like? Well, maybe that's not what it appears. Maybe over time, Blaire worked up this theory in her head regarding Riley, and in an upload posted to YouTube on June the 18th, 2017, her theories come to the forefront of the commentary, with multiple backhanded comments about Blaire's thoughts on the verity of Riley's gender identity. What were these thoughts?
Okay, Riley, I know you're having trouble with this whole transition thing, mainly that you haven't done it. You know, if you went on estrogen, your sex drive wouldn't be so high and you wouldn't be guilt-tripping people into having sex with you. Just saying.
But if anyone calls you a white supremacist, you deny it.
If anyone accuses you of guilt-tripping lesbians into sucking your dick by saying you're trans, deny it.
Blaire's suspicions were very clear. Riley's existence as a trans person was merely political and self-serving, and that in time this would be revealed as she wouldn't follow through on her transitioning properly. Why won't Riley take the estrogen, and what would it tell us about her? Ooh. Well,
hey everybody, so today, the day this video is going live, I'm going to be on my way to San Francisco in preparation for my facial feminization surgery, or FFS for short.
Somebody was about to have their well-deliberated theory swiftly debunked, leaving us to wonder if these playground hijinks were really worthwhile.
Several large YouTubers have been peddling the myth that I'm not really trans for well over a year now. They say I'm not a true trans because they claim I'm not taking any steps to transition, like not taking hormones and not having surgery.
On June the 26th, 2017, Riley Dennis would upload a video basically expressing what I would say to the theories advocated by Blaire and others in the community around this time, that it's none of their f***ing business, and that her status as a trans person shouldn't depend on what procedures she's embarking on.
These people who vehemently hate me and make videos misgendering me and insulting me and making assumptions about my personal life, they feel entitled to information about my personal life. But I don't owe them that. I don't owe anyone that. What happens in my personal life is nobody's business but my own. What medications I take, what surgeries I have, what steps I take to transition, all of that is my business and nobody else is entitled to that, especially not strangers on the internet. I have every right to keep all of that information to myself. Being trans is not defined by hormones or surgery. Surgeries and hormones do not change your gender identity. External things like that do not affect your internal sense of gender, which is what being trans is. So I don't want this to come across as me trying to prove that I'm a good trans now. I will be just as trans after FFS as I was before FFS. And I refuse to throw other trans people under the bus just because they don't take hormones or haven't had surgery or don't pass. Because I think that's a really gross way of gatekeeping who's allowed in the trans community.
However, it doesn't stop there, because Riley also reveals that she will be actively undergoing facial feminization surgery in the next few weeks, and had already been receiving hormone replacement therapy for almost a year, leaving those like Blaire, who had been chastising Riley pretty ferociously in the public sphere, and all these theories out to dry. I'll add that our progressive friend here didn't come unprepared, dropping an ample sum of receipts to reinforce just how unsubstantiated many of these claims made about her identity were.
All these claims by other YouTubers that I haven't been on hormones were just completely fabricated lies not based in anything I've ever said. In fact, a couple months ago, I got really worried about this. I knew that I hadn't talked about hormones since I had started them, but I thought maybe I had said something before that. So I searched through my Twitter timeline for any mentions of hormones or HRT, and I only found 2 tweets where I talked about hormones in relation to myself. One was from over a year ago, and I said I was planning on starting hormones as soon as I moved back to the US. The second one was also from over a year ago, and it was me saying that I was planning to start HRT soon. That's it. Those are the only times I've ever tweeted about hormones or HRT in relation to myself. And I was literally saying that I was planning to take hormones. Anybody who took half a second to search through my Twitter could have found this information. So I think I'm going to be starting hormones. I don't know about surgeries or anything like that yet. It's all kind of up in the air for me. But I have proof from YouTube and Twitter that I'm right and they're wrong. They've been maliciously and intentionally spreading lies about me.
Obviously, at approximately half an hour in total, there's a little more discussed than what I've spoken about now. But as a scathing clap back to many of the conspiracists, the video served its purpose, placing the ball quite squarely back into Blaire's court. Now, as Riley had indicated, Blaire wasn't the sole proponent of this narrative. However, as a reasonably sized creator and a transgender woman herself, it was pretty imperative that this little blunder be addressed. So on June the 29th, 3 days after Riley's shocking revelations, Blaire uploads, "I'm sorry."
Okay, so this is a video that I really did not expect to ever make. Ever. But those are always the most interesting ones, right?
In this video, Blaire takes responsibility for advancing the narrative that Riley was what many at the time regarded as a transgender, the political leeches. However, she also expands on the reasoning for what led her to such a conclusion, which I personally find a little dubious.
One of the biggest things that I took issue with was that I assumed that Riley was taking on a transgender identity and label for political purposes. Transgender. Now, I had a lot of reasons to believe this. The first being statements from Riley about growing up and never questioning their gender. As a trans person myself, that's very weird to hear, because growing up, my earliest memories in life were that of questioning my gender and of questioning the gender role that I was expected to fill. So as a trans person, I couldn't get in the headspace of what? How did you never question it? Another example is Riley's statements that trans people don't always want to transition. And again, as a trans person who's known many trans people, I couldn't wrap my head around that, because for me, transition was incredibly paramount. It was the key to me living the fulfilled life that I live now. I was also under the assumption, as hundreds of thousands of other people were, that Riley had no desire to transition and that Riley was not transitioning. That Riley was just taking on the label of trans with no real action behind it.
In retrospect, it's easy to say that these justifications seem rather flimsy. Anyone may grow up without questioning certain aspects of their identity, particularly in certain environments, and to doubt the veracity of a person's gender because they had the courage to admit that seems extremely cynical. And Blaire's other reason basically being that she went along with the mass consensus is barely a reason at all. Nonetheless, she had to explain her rationale whether it made sense or not. If that was the impression she received, then so be it. And once that was out of the way, she cut to the chase. And to be fair, her reflection is pretty strong and suitably self-critical.
But the incessant push to prove that Riley was not trans, I'm just realizing was probably really hurtful. And I'm aware that there's no way I would have known before the video where Riley actually discloses this information, but I feel like I was still in the wrong for trying to assume what was in someone's heart and mind when there was just simply no way I could have known.
And make no mistake, it should have been. In many ways, it was starting to sink in that there was a toxicity in this online community that she was contributing to. Beyond just the narratives of making assumptions about transgender individuals, deciding who was truly trans or not, there are other statements she had made. For example, this one towards fellow trans woman Steph Sanjati in 2016. When Steph tagged another trans woman to ask why Blaire has to attack their appearance when she clearly has no clue what she's doing, Blaire decides to jump in on the statement to inform Steph that she looks like a linebacker. It's so extra and unnecessary. In this specific case, I think Blaire misconstrued Steph's comment as an attack on her appearance rather than just going out of her way to offend. But it was indicative of how antagonistic she had become, how skeptical her own perception towards many of those she shared experiences with was. A much worse situation included her making a rather mean-spirited comment in response to a video by a person who was posting about her own experiences, once again going at her ability to pass as a woman.
So one thing has become pretty apparent since starting my YouTube channel, and that is that the trans community hates me.
Throughout her time on YouTube, she had made a deal about being the public enemy of many of these trans women, how they hated her, how some couldn't be as good looking, how they weren't as pretty. And beyond all the complex theories that could arise as to why she did this, it was simply rather catty behavior. As her platform grew, having such a demeanor that could influence the actions of viewers, particularly towards the subjects of her videos, some of whom transgender, this could easily cause unintended grief, and Blaire wouldn't want that, especially as someone who had experienced that personally. With reference to the video about misgendering, she was at risk of becoming everything she had criticized in the past. At the end of the day, personal ideology transcends identity, so singling transgender people out in the way that Blaire did on the basis of political disagreements alone wasn't really the most salubrious for either party.
And I'm someone who's had my transition picked apart online. There have been Reddit threads and 4chan threads with hundreds of comments on it of people trying to prove that I'm not trans because I haven't done this or that, or, you know, digging up my old pictures. And, you know, I'm a strong person, I'm a happy person, but to sit here and pretend like it doesn't affect me at all would just be a lie. So the thought that this entire time I've done that exact same thing to someone else and pushed that off on someone else with me, and I'm sorry.
Now, I think there were some who probably doubted the sincerity of this apology. At the end of the day, this was a narrative maintained over a year by an individual who, given her own self-admitted personal experiences, should have known better. However, at the same time, as a person who did have some authority within the community, speaking out on the matter would at least cause some to listen to her who may not otherwise relented. Maybe the growth and the community she was in had taken her on a bit of a power trip, and this was the warranted yank back down to earth she needed.
You know, this whole thing has really taught me a lesson that I should really try to stick to ideas, opinions, policy, rather than like trying to get in someone's head and like make judgments about something that's so personal and so nuanced.
To many, this appeared to be a turning point in Blaire's content, as she committed to making her videos more focused on their political roots and gravitating away from the petty remarks and character judgments that had landed her in hot water this time. Whether Riley accepted it herself, we'll never know, though she did upload a video just over a month later discussing how to make a good apology video. Although not mentioning Blaire's video at any point and using a different example completely to illuminate her thesis, it was a bit coincidental for some and seemingly reignited the feud between the two creators, even causing the video to be temporarily taken down in the process due to flagging. Fantastic. But deep breaths. Blaire still had a new leaf to turn over. We were going to talk about political content, and a bit of a Twitter spat between old nemeses isn't substantial enough to say that she had returned to old habits. No. As the content went, it looked like there was a new direction for Blaire. And to be honest, maybe it was the fresh start she needed. I'm going to open this part by at least defending Blaire White to a certain degree. I know, I even surprise myself sometimes. As much as I have detailed aspects of her channel and her behavior in a pretty critical light, it's important to recognize the zeitgeist and how that may have influenced her comportment. I know that to many people, even myself, that it may have seemed like she was pandering to seek approval from the online crowd, but throughout that period and even up to this day, one of the prevalent narratives espoused by individuals from within this realm was that these ideas were the counterculture, that this was a push pushback against the mainstream ideologies enforced by oppressive neo-Terrics who didn't even want to allow room for discussion. Blaire had been there herself. She'd set foot in the liberal university campuses and encountered that environment firsthand. That edginess that some wanted to shut down was part of that movement. It was greater back then. In her own mind, Blaire may have felt she was the one fighting back by saying what she said. She was joining the resistance, and this attitude that she adopted was part of that movement. That she wasn't pandering, she was adapting, and many other people did the same. Channels from all genres probably said stuff they would never be caught saying today. Many commentators being no exception. Here the idea lingered that maybe some of Blaire's antics were in part a product of their era, like some of the other creators who had also been in that position as well and had since reformed themselves. How this would only be answered by her content and how it would develop in relation to the evolving YouTube ecosystem. With the observed instant grounding her, this would definitely be a chance to realign those values.
I'm not infallible. I've definitely, over the course of doing political commentary for the past almost 2 years, I know I've probably said things that are not true, thinking they were true. I've definitely accidentally spread fake news, and I'm definitely not calling myself a fact machine.
2017 was an interesting time. In my opinion, it was when the pushback against presiding anti-SJW narratives on YouTube began to gather momentum.
And the science says we're all on a spectrum. No.
Yeah! This didn't necessarily quell the strength of certain commentators, but it definitely meant that a lot of discourse appeared to grow more balanced, with certain perspectives no longer going unchallenged. Alongside this, with certain US policy in particular skewing in concerning directions, it became more difficult for some to argue that conservatism was this oppressed political underdog. However, there was never an absence of content to chew on online, for a creator of any leaning, and Blaire was never starved for content. Blaire never positioned herself as a disillusioned liberal like some of her colleagues. She was a conservative and rather proud of the fact. Nonetheless, there were a few key issues that she liked to weigh in on. Ones that didn't necessarily fall too clearly on a liberal-conservative spectrum, more coming down to questions of common sense. And in the months following her apology to Riley Dennis, she appeared to readjust her trajectory, to present a more balanced perspective on political affairs that would reflect the current landscape.
According to police reports and not sensationalized headlines, this occurred in a private residence in an apartment, and it just happened to have occurred in a bathroom, and the person was a family friend. It was not stranger danger. It was not stranger trannies in the bathroom gonna get you danger. It just wasn't. Ian Miles Chong claimed straight up that it happened in a public bathroom.
For example, this video corrects misinformation surrounding a transgender individual convicted of sexual assault and the factually incorrect claims made by some on the right that this had occurred in a public restroom. Or we could talk about the upload at the start of 2018, where she reacted to some of her older content that she no longer associates with, and although still being somewhat mitigated in her self-criticism, still demonstrates awareness of her errors.
So there's been a bunch of pictures and videos that have come out that have led people to believe that she has some sort of neurological disorder, or she's generally just unfit to be president because she's ill. By the way, I still think Hillary Clinton is actually the devil, but I regret doing this video. She may have very well been sick, but the evidence I used in this video is reaching at best. It's so flimsy, it's so weak, and I'm surprised more people didn't call me out on it, honestly.
All of these examples show growth from previous incidents, hopefully allowing her to move towards being a more recent and independent voice within the community. Throughout this period, Blaire also seemed to pivot back towards more introspective videos that spoke about her personal life and development in her transition. There was a fair bit that warranted praise, and I don't want to understate that. At the same time, there were still signs that aspects of her content indulged perspectives without being fully transparent in the delivery of that information, such as the Trump in Hollywood video.
Hey guys, so today is a bit of a different kind of video. We're doing a social experiment video. You guys know I've been doing on the street stuff, and Joey and I had this sick idea of walking around West Hollywood, which is the gay area of Hollywood, and just, wearing a little hat that we think people would be really upset about.
Now, on the surface, this is a standard intolerant left video, and obviously when witnessing violence against someone, many would feel naturally shocked. In the description, a disclaimer sits informing viewers that Blaire and her partner did not act in a way that would have provoked the attacks, implying the hats were the only variable of interest here. This caught the eye of many on social media given its content and led to some circulation and interest from those outside her typical audience. Nonetheless, this also reached the fact-checking website Snopeskin, who contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and were informed that Blaire and her husband had crossed a dividing line set up specifically to prevent any physical altercation. Now, does this justify the behavior of those depicted in the video? No, but at the same time, it's hardly wearing a Trump hat in Hollywood, moreover wearing it to an anti-Trump protest. I'll add the caveat that she does have a drink thrown in her face at the end of the video, which, although Snopes cast suspicion on comparing her to Alex Jones, I don't really think is completely fair, and could well have happened. At the same time, given the framing, doubt is obviously going to be inevitable, and given how heavily edited the video is, it's hard to arbitrate exactly what happened. But maybe that's just clickbait for you. Nonetheless, certain concerns harbored go beyond a single video.
No, these other beasts, let me not say beasts, but these other people who are pressuring people to be with them, it's gross.
Yes, I'd say there are still comments present that showcased her rather flippant nature and desire to one-up those she viewed unfavorably, but these were asides and a far cry from what she had perpetuated in the past. We can all be divas from time to time, can't we?
I mean, let's be honest, most of the people who complain about this kind of thing are the worst people, the most undateable, cringy, miserable individuals, just very tacky.
Well, I don't know, but as we move further into 2018, she seemed to distance herself more and more from the political community that she had previously shared propinquity with. Her content gravitated towards topics that felt more vlog-oriented in a way, and this inevitably yielded some questions from viewers who were familiar with her more outspoken self. Although I think many were expecting a new direction, this certainly was a different flavor. Eventually, she'd upload a video explaining exactly why she'd done this and the reasons behind it, and to be fair to her, many of them seemed quite justified and believable.
So the simplest answer as to why I've steered away from politics, at least recently, and at least for now, maybe not forever, is that, quite frankly, I guess just the best way to put it is politics, and political commentary specifically, has effed up my life. The FBI incidents, the going out in public and having people try to fight me, the doxing, the stalking, the people entering my building, all that kind of stuff, my family being harassed, and, you know, I am at such a place where I feel like, has it been worth it? I moved to LA almost a year ago, and one thing about LA is there's a lot of work here, so a lot of other political commentators, other people who you guys know, I'm not talking about obscure people here, a lot of them either live in LA or they're constantly in and out for work, filming something, doing whatever they do. So I've met almost all of them. People I've either been on their show or on a show with them, or I went to a dinner with them, an event with them, or I became close with some of them. The amount of them that I've met that have told me either directly or in a roundabout way that's very clear that they don't believe everything that they say that they believe when they're on camera. A lot of them just flat out don't believe. They're just actors.
Grifters, threats, doxers, they're all plausible in such a polarizing community with such potential. And if you can't handle that, then it's understandable that you'd want to take a step back. It'd make anyone feel rather dirty once they've been exposed to it long enough. And the video itself feels like Blaire finally washing her hands of such toxicity. This was the movement we needed.
It comes in such extremes. It's like something really amazing will happen and I'll get like the coolest opportunity ever, but then something really effing terrible will happen. And it's these crazy highs and lows that I feel like are a lot more extreme than if I just did other types of content that make me equally as happy, you know?
But were those hands as clean as they appeared?
That venting session was so necessary. When I say it was so necessary, it was so necessary. It felt amazing.
The video about why Blaire changed seemed pretty conclusive in the moment, rather scathing towards many aspects of the community and even the media beyond that, ending on a rather affirmative note that would cause many to assume that she was mostly finished with political content, at least for a while.
And it's just not a world that I feel super comfortable in. Do I still care very much about politics? Absolutely. But being involved in this like commentary world is so toxic.
However, it seems the contrary appeared to be the case. In fact, it looked as though Blaire's open venting made her feel more reassured in returning to topics that she had distanced herself from. And after a month interval, she returned to a schedule of more politically oriented content. I'm not entirely sure why. It's not like many of the concerns that she had outlined in her video could subside. In fact, you could argue her shedding light on them had only heightened the attention they could receive. But if that's how she felt, then that's her prerogative.
Hi. So I know I said in the last video that I wasn't going to talk about politics anymore. That was a lie. I'm a liar. Because women lie. Just kidding. That was a joke and probably not fitting for this video, but...
Well, I appreciate the honesty, Blaire. Her first video back was a response to the slogan, "Believe all women," a rather contentious phrase which some advocates claim has been unfairly conflated with the similar though not identical "Believe women." As you can probably assume, Blaire's position on this slogan was unsurprisingly quite critical, though not necessarily making the distinction mentioned prior. Nevertheless, the video was well received and she appeared to return to her routine schedule of content. This may have spiked some unease amongst those still skeptical of her intentions, especially considering some of the clickbait and chosen subjects. Right, Dennis? But hope may have been instilled as she appeared to stand by her reformed demeanor and refrain from shabby character attacks, even reconciling with one of the individuals she had previously been rather insensitive towards, and recognizing her responsibility. So all in all, we could say there was progress made. Correct? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, because again, as time elapsed, it felt like this was waning.
So today I have one of the cringiest videos I have seen in a long time on the interwebs.
I mean, the content itself was still lightweight at best and a bit misleading at the worst. I know it's kind of Blaire's style to not create the most demanding content, but conversely, I think there are videos which just end up failing rather in their portrayal of the source material, and once again fall back onto this idea of catering to a perspective. Now, obviously anyone would be pleased that a content is less incendiary than it was before, but at the same time, having many prominent flaws and just subtracting the evident offensiveness previously present doesn't necessarily make it good. And make no mistake, there isn't a great divergence from precursory output. For example, this video where she responds to a notoriously unpopular Teen Vogue upload.
It's important that we really break down what are we talking about when we talk about sex and gender, and is there something called biological sex, and what does that mean?
Now, there are certainly points in the original that could be disputed, but a load of Blaire's arguments are pretty lazy too.
This idea that the body is either male or female is totally wrong, and I am living proof of that.
We know
She literally just said that she's proof of that and didn't explain why. Like, it went on to the next scene.
Blaire, she literally elaborates on this later on in the section.
I identify as an intersex woman. I have gone through surgeries that have really stuck with me through my whole life and affected a lot of different parts of my life just so that I can fit into this box of female.
The video's over 7 minutes long and these segments are even shorter, so you'd need to have a pretty short attention span to miss it. And as said, it's not an infallible upload, but she skips over so much of it and responds to the parts where she can drop a sassy takedown comment, some of which doesn't even work in the greater context of the original video. Another example would be the classic "The Mob Tried to Cancel Me Again" upload, where Blaire is rather angry that an event she was part of hosted by Walk Away, a prominent LGBT movement promoting exodus of the Democratic Party, was moved last minute due to an open letter and accompanying dossier published by online communities, documenting what they had deemed as behavior contrary to the values of the venue hosting the event. She initially scolded the LGBT center for their decision to refuse their guests, and all the fans they would inevitably put out of pocket with the impending cancellation, a comment that some would deem slightly ironic given that she was accused of doing the same 1.5 years prior for a debate with Theron and ContraPoints, another trans creator on the left of the spectrum whom she had debated previously. However, that was a while back, and so was a lot of what she had been accused of in this dossier, so she took to YouTube to defend herself.
Today I am going to be addressing the mob. But more specifically, what I wanted to address in this video is the petition that was sent to the LGBT Center from activists online to have me deplatformed. The petition and what they were saying was absolutely just riddled with misrepresentations, lies, exaggerations, and just bullshit about me. So we're gonna go over some pictures right now that people love to bring up when they're trying to ruin something for me. People are claiming that that photo is me holding up a white supremacist hand signal. So to address that specifically, so stupid I have to, this is again an okay hand signal. This is not a white supremacist hand signal.
In the video, however, Blaire picks out 2 isolated examples from the document in question, and even then somehow manages to take one of them out of context.
So here's another photo people love digging up from 2016, a photo of me apparently in blackface.
This is all well and good, but she's omitted the caption, and this caption was present in the document, so there's no real reason to do this otherwise unless you view it as strictly irrelevant to the discourse, which I would find unlikely personally. Now, does this make the offense terrible or even comparable to a lot of what is normally considered blackface? Not necessarily, because if you donned it with the primary intent of being a beauty treatment, then that's important information. However, it was still posted to social media as a reference to blackface, and that is of interest, and Blaire was aware of that. However, instead we have to deal with the incredulous tone and touch from the astounded commentator who puts all these bottom feeders in their place.
It's just so ridiculous. And it's even more ridiculous that people have the nerve to misrepresent someone like that.
It's strange to me because it doesn't seem like a point that's impossible to respond to in its full context, and yet it was still watered down. Even with this considered, there's a lot of the document that Blaire just doesn't respond to at all. Some of it I can understand, she doesn't consider it a big deal. Other parts, well,
be in a lot better place. But unfortunately, we're at a place where instead of actually defeating your political adversaries with logic and reason or debate or hell, even a screaming match, it seems to be easier to brand them as bigots and brand them as people who don't have a right to speak rather than debunking their speech. And that's incredibly sad, let me tell you.
When videos are like this, I just wonder why they're even made at all. And maybe that's what I get for making videos as long as I do. Yet it seemed for every step Blaire took forward, they were offset by shortcomings that could have been alleviated if she'd been a bit more meticulous or upfront in the material she presented. And that for someone who valued facts and information so much, they could really be lacking sometimes, for the most pointless reasons as well. It's hard to fully diagnose what was going on, because it never felt fully malicious, just very lackluster, and I received the impression that maybe Blaire was becoming tired of her content. Maybe she was on autopilot. Maybe she needed a new calling. Well, as we move deeper into 2019, it seems she may have found it. So I guess it's time to introduce a side character. This is an individual by the name of Jessica Yaniv. She first hit the headlines in mid-2019 after filing multiple complaints with the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal as she was refused Brazilian waxes by beauticians and seeking damages from each individual involved. She claimed this was discrimination on the basis of her transgender identity. However, the defendants contested they were not comfortable or experienced with her genitalia, which included a phallus. There's a lot that takes my interest regarding this case that could be discussed in the future, but for now all I'll say is that there are many that understandably didn't sympathize with her plight and questioned her intentions in initiating these proceedings given certain details. Additionally, others following the situation decided to dig further into her antics, discovering a consistent pattern of rather inappropriate and predatory behavior, provoking condemnation and backlash towards the controversial figure. However, it appears there was another person with an eye on the debacle, Blaire White. Now, Blaire had perhaps signaled her intent to pursue a new direction a week before, although once again not in the most graceful form, after she had confused a Twitter user by the name of Princess Steph with a TikTok predator by the name of Mama Steph, in full-fledged serving the wrong Chris Hansen style. She had deleted these tweets shortly after realizing her error, though I'm not ever sure if amends were made. Nonetheless, a good few days later, she probably felt on more sure footing as she launched a pretty extensive attack on Yaniv, who she branded decisively in her upload as the trans predator.
Week. This is trans activist Jessica Yaniv. Now, this person is the walking, talking, living and breathing embodiment of what people fear when it comes to trans people. I do not believe this is a trans woman. I believe this is a predator posing as a trans woman. Now, make no mistake, none of these messages are how women talk to each other or trans women talk to women or anyone. Yaniv clearly has an obsession with, feminine products and women and girls, and it's incredibly disturbing, and this needs to be called out.
The video delineates the evidence accumulated against Jessica while also discussing the greater impact on the trans community and how the general public may regard it, lambasting the activists who haven't spoken out.
Why are you silent when this type of thing comes up? This should be part of your job. It should be part of your job as an activist who wants to apparently put trans people in a better light and better social standing. It is important for us to distance ourselves from this. I'm not here to police what, other trans public figures do with their social media and with their platform, but they seem to complain about a lot of stuff, right? And I know they've seen this. So maybe to those people, I would ask, when you're writing, your 17th tweet about how bad I am, maybe use one tweet to be like, that's not us, this is horrible.
In many ways, these assertions don't feel out of place for a standard Blaire White video, but the narrative of exposing someone for such egregious behavior appeared to provide it with greater moral foundations, attracting praise from a broad spectrum of viewers and galvanizing her ratings and engagement like seldom before. And when a formula works and you seem to be enjoying it, like Blaire was, you pursue it a bit further.
I feel like this channel is becoming a predator hunter channel, and I'm actually 100% okay with it.
So a few more videos go up on the matter. A couple of these continue to follow the Univ saga, including a belated livestream in which both the participants clash heads pretty explosively. They discuss a medley of subjects, with Blaire occasionally just driving home the very pertinent point of how much more attractive than Jessica she is, instead of merely calling Univ out for a blatant bigotry.
You didn't answer the question. If you go, for example,
no one's denying me a facial. I'm sorry, but no one's going to deny me a facial. And honestly, no one would. Okay, I don't want to deal with fantasies in which I want.
I know, but Blaire, this is not a fantasy. I can show you right now that they did deny me a facial.
I mean, maybe you, but I'm just saying for me that wouldn't happen.
Overall though, I think it does contain some interesting character indictments about Univ at least, so I won't complain too much on that front. However, some may begin to question this general direction on the basis that Blaire's content was portraying transgender individuals in a negative light. After all, what does a person's identity have to do with how they behave? Well, in another video about an individual who Blaire believed to be enacting sexual roleplay disguised as transgender activism, she appears to explain this justification.
But what we don't need is people who are not even trans enacting this predatory behavior under the guise of being trans, under the blanket, the protection of being trans, really. People like Jessica Univ and people like Stefankny actually use the trans label as a protective force field to stop people from criticizing their predatory behavior. It's not who they are, it is their scapegoat.
Similar to a Jessica Univ video, it's clear that she feels there are certain people who are masquerading their rather sick depravity under the veil of the transgender label. And as a transgender person herself, Blaire wants nothing to do with that. She wants to let people know that such behavior has no place in her community. I suppose it's an understandable sentiment when you have an activist community who you want to set yourself apart from, but I think you also have to be wary that you avoid perpetuating the conflation yourself, that you're not just pouring fuel onto the fire to then try and put it out. Blaire seemed pretty pleased with this direction, even dropping an Onision video in the process, who isn't trans as far as I know. However, there was still a couple red flags that maybe she was a bit too emboldened by her newfound penchant for exposing people.
Where drag queens are brought into public libraries, elementary schools, preschools, kindergartens to read to children. And they come in drag, and it's supposed to be this thing that's very mind-opening for children. It's just this super woke thing. So meet this man, Albert Garza. Drag queen performer, has performed numerous times at Drag Queen Story Hour to underage young children. And what do you know? He's a convicted predator, but is somehow still allowed to read to children as a drag queen.
In this video, she decided to cover a predator who was participating in a drag queen program, providing it with a title as endearing as ever. However, when initially released, it had this thumbnail. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that this drag queen in the thumbnail has nothing to do with any of the charges actually mentioned in the video. In fact, the only acknowledgement of this person is at the start, where they're once again so tastefully placed alongside the news report of the actual offender's conviction.
Bringing drag performers together with little kids is kind of a perfect relationship. I'm hoping what the kids get out of coming to Storytime is an opportunity to see that things that are different aren't scary. Relationships and gender identities and everything.
A revelation that a registered sex offender participated in a Storytime for children might be surprising in and of itself.
When called out for this, Blaire did make the change relatively quickly, but it does lead one to wonder how many times this can happen. I don't really like the video much either. It felt like the reservoir for such content was already running dry, especially given the fact that the video once again just sucks.
And to make matters worse, there's a library board in Wichita that can't seem to agree. They can't come to a clear consensus on whether or not convicted child predators should be reading to their kids as drag queens. I'm not joking. It's a thing. This article states, board members were split between those who said registered sex offenders should be automatically disqualified from ever giving a talk at the library, and those who said it should be allowable in some circumstances. What circumstances is it okay for a predator to speak to kids?
Blaire, have you heard of scrolling down? It's literally written there in the article. the exceptions that could be considered. You can disagree or dispute them, but you can't act like they don't exist and get all hot and bothered when they're right there. Talk about due diligence. Deep breaths. Focus.
But what I am saying, which is what something that LGBT advocates don't seem to ever get through their head, is that sometimes you guys are so lax and so interested in being woke that you leave the door open for this. Stop. Like, I hate to constantly get all think of the children on you, but think of the children.
Shut up. Okay, I have to admit I'm feeling rather faint and I need to sleep this frustration off.
This is Bravo 6, we're on our way out. On your feet, soldier, we are leaving.
Okay, let's regather myself. Where were we? Nobody likes predatory behavior. It can be pretty much universally denounced, and Blaire going after people who had acted in such a way was a goldmine, whether always completely accurate in the assertions she made or not. However, it also bestowed Blaire with power that she'd previously not been accustomed with, this social gravitas, a currency of credibility that extended beyond a political clique.
This complete change of heart if in person you weren't so fake. I continue seeing how fraudulent they are and how gross of a community or genre of content that is. It's starting to again affect my willingness to be part of that community. And obviously all doesn't mean literally all. There's 2 or 3 good ones, but the overwhelming majority and those people that you guys know are just liars.
Now, when she made the video about why she had changed, it may not have served her channel much purpose in the context of the political content that followed almost immediately after, but it did begin to cement a distancing from certain highly polarizing figures that throughout much of the channel's early stages, she'd found herself rather congenial with. The political community that was once rather tight-knit in 2016 had definitely divided itself in the years ensuing, to those who had become more amenable to leftism, like Sean Head for example, and those who were still quite resistant to it, and this would only become more lucid as time transpired.
Both of them very much. I really do like both of them. But it's become obvious that Sean Head is becoming radicalized towards communism. And in fact, I, with my burner account on Twitter, have tweeted at her, look, dude, by the end of the year at this rate, you're going to be a communist. And she replied with never, and then deleted that tweet. And all we see now is this radical cascade into what appears to be just full communism. And I'm just staggered by it.
Blaire was no different in this sense at least. 2016, Blaire hung around with a very different crew than her 2019 entourage. The strange detail in Blaire's situation is that she maintained a lot of her narratives that remained critical of communities that she'd always been outspoken about. However, pairing them with topics that exposed predators appeared to win over a larger audience and push her more into the mainstream. Finishing the saga off on the Onision video was a fitting end, especially given the apolitical nature of despising him. Hating people who behave in such a manner transcends politics, and even if you don't agree with Blaire, a lot of people found it in themselves to look past their differences to support her crusade. In a way, it's what finally made her mainstream, which is a pretty incredible feat considering less than a few months ago she was lamenting cancellation of the walkaway event due to the antics of her and her peers, and her continued involvement with that movement since. However, as soon as she'd embraced her new direction, she once again shifted course back to more political content. This was fair enough, I suppose. She likely would have received flack for over-stigmatizing the community if she'd only spoken about the worst of the worst through an archetypal lens. On the flip side though, there wasn't any greater cause that could shield her from criticism for shortcomings that may be present in her content, so it was more imperative than ever that she be rigorous and balanced in her presentation. Was she though? Well, I mean, let's tackle the 3 most prevalent issues with Blaire White throughout this video so far. Poor research, reckless insensitivity, and I suppose what many would regard as invalidation. The last one you'd hope would be a mostly outdated criticism given the fact that she'd obviously acknowledged how unfair she'd been in the past towards trans women who didn't pass enough in her eyes, and how she wanted to move back to more serious, sensible content. However, the upload after this exposing phase, she uploaded a video called The Truth About ContraPoints and Non-Binary, covering the incident that transpired in the political community at that time, where Contra had faced some pretty hostile resistance after expressing a predilection towards attitudes and environments with a more traditional approach to gender roles over the, quote, hyper-woke spaces. Now, obviously, this is a person sharing their experiences and thoughts, and even if you disagree or think it could have been worded more sensitively, some people definitely overreacted. However, Blaire had her own take. Well, maybe her opinion has reformed since then.
Of course, speaking of transition, from what I can see, the overwhelming majority of non-binary people do not transition. They don't get surgery, they don't get hormones, etc. Of course, there are some, and there's going to be someone in the comments, I know of someone. Okay, cool, you know of someone. In terms of gender, I have about as much in common with a non-binary person as I do my fiance, who is not trans, just a guy, because he stayed at point A, just like non-binary people do.
No, not really. In fact, her video is packed with a large set of assumptions about the non-binary community, not really backed up with any proof or evidence, appearing kind of pissed off, to be honest.
So non-binary is a topic that comes up on my channel in passing, but I've never really gone in depth about my feelings towards non-binary people, non-binary as a concept, in terms of gender, obviously. And this person insisted that they were trans as well. They were the same thing as me, right? This person was born male, presents as male, has not transitioned to anything but male, doesn't mind going by male pronouns, but yet I'm supposed to accept that I'm the same thing as this person. I'm sorry, but I'm not.
I also can't really endorse her assertion that this is the first proper time she's made her feelings apparent on the matter. I think she's been pretty clear. Even in the midst of her hiatus from the political community, she uploaded a video where she reacts to a non-binary individual with her friend and fellow creator Eden the Doll, and makes some pretty disparaging remarks while also continuously failing to address them correctly.
When you're assigned male at birth, you have to fight like hell to be feminine. You have to fight like hell to be feminine.
He had to fight? What was your fight, girl? Picking the right shade of lipstick? He's talking about a fight to be feminine when it's like, oh, a fight like surgery? Oh, no, he's not done that. A fight like hormones? No, he hasn't done that. A fight like therapy? Oh, he hasn't done that. A fight like changing your name legally? Oh, he hasn't done that. So what's the fight? I feel like whenever people says like to refer to them as they and them, they're like kind of saying that they have like multiple personalities, like split personalities, like a million people in them.
She also chose this practically unknown non-binary person as the, quote, worst SJW over numerous other public figures in another video between then and now.
So here's one where she claims there's no such thing as male and female brains. That's what's really, really annoying is you have all these random, honestly, cisgender people claiming to be trans to look cool and spreading out things like there's no such thing as male and female brains.
And then we find ourselves over here, where she keeps reiterating the fact that non-binary people are not the same as her, which is all well and good, I'm happy for her, but it's a misleading point.
Now, take a look at this very short clip in which I tell a non-binary individual that we are not the same.
My name is Blaire, I'm transgender, and I'm a Republican.
My name is Jamie. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as a queer, non-binary trans femme. I also identify in the A spectrum of asexuality. I believe non-binary is under the trans umbrella.
I completely reject how non-binary people specifically have injected themselves into the trans label. I am a transsexual. There's a medical basis for that. There's a scientific basis for that. And for non-binary, it's really not the case.
You don't know my life. You don't know my experiences with gender dysphoria.
We don't know each other's life. I'm not saying that. You're the one that said that I was erasing you as trans. I am. Like, you're not trans. Like, there's a medical definition of being a transsexual.
I'm gonna stop you. Jamie, how are you doing?
I'm okay.
You're okay?
Yeah.
Do you feel like talking? You don't have to.
Blaire plays this clip like it's some huge gotcha, but it actually just shows the disparity between the 2 points she's trying to make. Someone has asserted they fall under the umbrella, and Blaire disputes that, which is her prerogative. But that's not equatable to saying that another person was claiming you were the same. In fact, they seek to emphasize they believe in a more inclusive label that Blaire seems rather bothered by. You could only reclaim that these 2 points are compatible if you solely derive your identity from your trans label, something that I'm sure Blaire would never advocate for.
No, I am not trying to bash non-binary people. I'm not trying to say that I'm better than them, above them, higher than them. We all put our pants on one leg at a time. We are all equals here. What I am saying is that we are different, okay? It seems to me that the goal of non-binary people is to completely destroy and deconstruct the binary And the goal of trans people is to operate within the binary, as in moving from one to the other.
Listen guys, I'm talking about peace, love, understanding. I love everyone. We're all equal, especially the greengrocers. I'm sure some of them are great people, but I'm pretty sure the greengrocers are kidnapping cats and claiming the reward money when missing posters are put up. I have to save some of this, but the point being, if you didn't like Blaire before, she didn't seem to be more sensitive, and when it came to validation...
This is someone who is not trans. This is someone who's claiming to be trans by what? Putting on lipstick and then going in the media talking about trans issues as if they know.
Well, if there's moving the goalposts, Blaire was moving the gateposts. But at least she still had her research sorted, right? Well, let's talk about it. Okay, here's the thing. The first 2 points that we've discussed, Blaire may defend herself on. She never promoted herself as a bastion of sensitivity. On the contrary, in fact, she knows she's the problematic queen. If she has strong opinions, she's going to express them regardless of who she offends. If you were going to criticize her, you could say that this sort of attitude makes her more sensitive videos, such as her apology video to Riley Dennis, somewhat disingenuous.
There have been Reddit threads and 4chan threads with hundreds of comments on it of people trying to prove that I'm not trans because I haven't done this or that, or, you know, digging up my old pictures. And, you know, I'm a strong person, I'm a happy person, but to sit here and pretend like it doesn't affect me at all would just be a lie.
However, even with that said, she may respond to this, claiming that these two situations are not equivalent. After all, her whole point was that non-binary individuals were not the same as her, and this mostly staved off the criticism, even if it did feel like an us versus them narrative sometimes, no matter how much Blaire declared there was no ill will in her rhetoric.
And honestly, I know I'm gonna get crucified for this video, but I really don't care. My intention is not to, again, bash or put down or belittle non-binary people. I really don't care whatever you identify as. Have at it.
We'll put this on the back burner for now though, and turn our attention back to the third issue, one that we wouldn't necessarily expect to be present in a video like this, that being poor research. This is the one aspect of content that Blaire wouldn't really have any defense against. After all, you can't really dismiss it and say, deal with it liberals, I'm bad at fact-checking. Intellectual rigor is to be aspired for, regardless of political affiliation. However, in the aforementioned upload, not to be outdone, Blaire manages to tick all 3 boxes with a rather bizarre citation.
Another thing is that there is a long historical basis for transsexuals. Like, as early as surgery was a thing, people were having the desire to change their sex. Gender dysphoria, previously known as gender identity disorder, is something that has been around forever. Whereas this new wave of non-binary is literally something that's popped up maybe since 2014 and on. Google Trends shows it.
Ah yes, Google Trends, the bulwark for scientific grounding. Now, I personally use it, and I have used it, for illustrating public interest or awareness of a trend, but not for the existence of an entity, and Blaire's assertion can be quickly challenged with a bit of actual research. For a video titled The Truth About ContraPoints and Non-Binary, there isn't really much ContraPoints, and there's also a distinct lack of truth, though I'll give her points for having no deficiency on the non-binary front.
Recently, Sam Smith came out as non-binary and wants the entire world to use they/them pronouns because it wasn't enough to be rich and famous. He also wants everyone around to bow down and, change their language for him.
The videos that follow were no less brash, with her attitude seemingly becoming more and more impertinent. But I don't really want to focus on that, and let me make it clear. We could talk about the thumbnails that continue to feature people who have nothing to do with the video topic and merely serve to allow Blaire to pull her grossed out face, despite the fact she was literally just called out for that. Or we could talk about her ridiculous and pointless flame war with a smaller creator, where she once again resorts to insulting the person's trans identity regardless of what they said. Just grow up. The antics that persisted after this with the photoshopping and all that crap, I have nothing else to add. It is self-explanatory at this point.
Oh, I feel like I start out so many of my videos saying, today's video is kind of sad, today's video is kind of dark. This one is too, just being real.
So, with all that behind us, let's talk about the children, a topic that has always been very close to Blaire's heart, and one that has also been the center of gender discourse for a long time. Certain commentators in particular take an interest because it's a sensitive and controversial topic that has led to some mishaps in the past, and obviously in these instances, there can be ramifications of great moral significance. At the same time, with such topics given their sensitivity, it requires attention to detail and respect for those who may be affected by the consequences such narratives may invoke. Blaire, like she did with a fair few other subjects, held a pretty cautious stance on the matter, but mostly tried to talk about the issue from a perspective of common sense, a safe bet with the internet at least. However, her track record on the subject wasn't the cleanest. She had previously generated some controversy a few years back in a now-deleted video titled "Child Transitioning Equals Child Abuse," the title being the least provocative component. In the infamous upload, she claims that the mother is pimping out her child's identity for profit.
What are the odds that a transgender activist gives birth to a kid who ends up being transgender? Shocking coincidence, right? So then the question becomes, was she an ideologue before or after her kid became trans? Well, her pinned tweet is of her doing a public talk years ago in which she explains how her child transitioned at 4. A really quick Google of the mother shows that she's been doing press and interviews and talks for years about her kid, and I'm sorry, but this just reeks of pimping out your kid. She also has her own organization called Transparenting. She sells t-shirts. I mean, this is lucrative for her, and I'm sure that this cover of National Geographic is just her big break.
This was not just debatable, but frankly preposterous, and research showed that the mother, who was the prime recipient of these characterizations, was practically the antithesis of everything that Blaire alleged, leaving many to arraign the creator for inducing a tidal wave of hatred against a person who was merely trying to support her daughter. But okay, that was 2016, Blaire. This was 2019. I'm not going to give a spiel about the fact that she had a wider audience now, because we know that doesn't play a large role in dictating her narrative, but allow me to give a brief preamble about this situation. Essentially, just under a couple years back, a child became the center of a political tug-of-war after the divorced parents disputed their gender. The father in this family claimed that the mother was forcefully transitioning one of their children against their will, setting up a page and fundraiser to fight the custody battle after a jury ruled against him. This caught wind in the media and online conservative circles, causing the issue to become quickly politicized as well, with one allegedly highly incriminating clip making the rounds, in which the child claims the mother told them that they were a girl.
You're a boy, right?
No, I'm a girl.
Who told you you're a girl?
Mommy.
Blaire decides to weigh in on this matter. After all, her personal investments run deep, and she delivers a decisive verdict on the clip in question.
So you guys, this video to me is, I don't even want to get emotional. It's so sad. I think first of all, children going through custody battles and, being weaponized by either party or both parties and just going through that is so sad. And adding in this transgender layer, but I have to be honest, the child saying, my mom told me I'm a girl, not cool. Now, I've been looking into this story, and many people are saying that this child has been coached and is being forced into this, and just based on what I have seen, I have to agree with that. That is personally my opinion.
She then moves on to the regular narratives about the transgender community and the discussion about putting children on hormones at the age of 7 and the dangerous consequences it can have. The institutions who have supported this and pushed it through and caused a great threat to this child who is far too young to make such a decision for themselves.
I don't know. Sometimes I seriously lose faith that trans people will ever be accepted into society and integrated into society when just the insanity that comes out of the community is so constant. I don't know, I just feel like we never have anything positive coming out of the community. I feel like it's always, if you don't date me, you're transphobic. Yes, 7-year-olds can decide to transition. Yes, male athletes who popped 2 estrogen pills should be able to compete against women and demolish them. When is the community going to step up and realize things are going too far and regain some credibility here? Because it's not looking good. It really isn't. Honestly, the biggest thing for me, this is just like a kind of different rant, the biggest thing for me is that the trans community seems to have no self-awareness of how they're viewed by the outside world. They literally have no clue. A lot of these people are so caught up in their own sort of discourse and people who agree with them that they don't realize how insane it sounds that a 7-year-old is having his gender changed legally, is going to appointments for puberty blockers, and they just think it's so bewildering that anyone could possibly, conceivably think, should we slow down just a little bit? No, transphobe. It's just disgusting.
But here, Blaire was engendering much more trouble than any of the people that she seems so concerned about.
I'll say this, in the off chance that the mother of James is viewing this video, I don't want to come across as I am attacking you. In fact, I would like to publicly reach out via this video if you watch it and say, let's have a conversation. I would love to talk to you. I am not some random internet troll. I am not some anonymous person on Twitter. I am not some hater. I'm a trans woman myself, and if anything, I've walked this path that your son and yourself may seem to think is the right path for him, and I'm actually willing to talk to both of you.
But it's okay, I guess. At least she's willing to have a discussion. Well, Blaire, let's talk about it.
You know, it's so sad, but I hope to God that James lucks out in the sense that he grows up and truly is trans and also doesn't want a family, because those are the only two circumstances that would validate the choices being made for him right now. Is if he both is really trans, to which he won't regret the medications, and that he doesn't want kids, because it already seems to be decided up for him right now that that's the case, so.
Before it was circulated by a load of conservative outlets, creators, and even some on the liberal end of the spectrum, this whole story was pretty comprehensively investigated by a creator called Timber on Toast, who quashes most of the narratives put forward by those in favor of the father. You should go and watch that one after this, but he shows that the dad in this instance is by no means a helpless passenger losing his son, but someone who instigated a lot of trouble which was practically rebuked by every medical professional who supported the contrary perspective.
Dr. Johnson receives a letter from the child's father in which he makes allegations about the child's mother. This letter is ignored by Dr. Johnson, who sees the child and diagnoses them with gender identity disorder. Following the diagnosis, the medical center tries to contact the father to keep him involved in the process. He delays scheduling an interview with them, saying that he is gathering information he wants to present to the head doctor. The records show that he never followed up on scheduling that interview. The therapist confirms the diagnosis of gender dysphoria which was made by Dr. Johnson, and advises the mother that it would be better for the child's psychological well-being to socially affirm them as Luna, which is a girl's name that the child has chosen for themselves. The therapist advises scheduling another appointment when the child is 8 or 9 to discuss whether or not hormone blockers are an appropriate measure to take. By this time, it transpires that the child's father has contacted Dr. Johnson, Child Protective Services, Genesis Clinic, and the follow-up psychologist, making allegations to all of them that the mother is abusing the child. He states that he suspects the mother is suffering from Munchausen by proxy, the very same mental illness proposed by Dr. Michelle Cretella, the lady quoted in all those articles I read about this case. None of the professionals who received the father's letters find his allegations to be credible.
This information can also be found in court documents published around that time if you're fun enough to read them. And I'm not saying this necessarily makes the mother a saint or that this whole hubbub even has a bearing on the child's identity, which has now probably been completely disrupted by political figures sticking their nose in far too deep to a case they have no knowledge of, and interfering with a court case which has been deliberated and heard out by a jury. However, once again, a preconceived narrative was pushed as truth without question. I mean, hell, the governor of Texas basically complained that his own judicial system wasn't working well enough.
I love you. Please leave a comment. I want to know everyone's thoughts. Please share this video as well. I feel like this is extremely important.
Blaire was a part of that, and she of course doesn't have the mainstream draw of any of the figures who took to Twitter to make known their outrage, but it was once more wrapped in those points of view that tried to make her look like this disillusioned observer and frustrated moderate that was becoming more and more tiresome by the upload.
And honestly, even wearing what they want, if I'm being completely honest, I don't have an issue with that at all. But the mother has been going to consultations for puberty blockers, is quote, not ruling it out, and it seems like this boy's fate is already decided. You know, I do believe 7-year-olds can experience gender dysphoria. I was one of them, but no 7-year-old is prepared mentally, emotionally, anything to make the decision to go on puberty blockers and then hormones and then live as a woman at 7.
You also see in the court notes that there is no concrete plan for the child to go on hormone blockers. The child is 6 years old. It's stated that when they are 8 or 9, they will have another consultation where they will seek advice on whether or not hormone blockers are the correct course of action.
Back when she was edgier than this and controversial, you could at least say it was pretty clear where she would stand. But here it just felt like a bit of a ruse. Blaire constructs a fair few of her videos like this, especially when they're short and quite loosely formulated. She starts with a root situation and branches off with a variety of observations and opinions. You can deal with a few of those branches being off, a few points that don't quite hit. However, if the whole root discussion is off, then the video is basically nullified. Most people, left or right wing, wouldn't advocate for young children undergoing hormone therapy because, like Blaire said, there can be serious consequences for a decision undertaken at such a young age when one still has a very uncertain grasp of their identity. However, because the mother wasn't actually advocating that, Blaire's secondary points here don't feel authentic. It often feels like Blaire shapes the evidence to fit the narrative, rather than vice versa, which is risky business with such a high-stakes case. And she wasn't the only person who did it here, I will make that clear, but there's a point where if you use your identity as a badge of credibility, you need to certify it by proving you're better than those who are pushing identical points of view. Otherwise, that additional experience means very little.
Now, I'm transgender and I had feelings of gender dysphoria at that age as well. But one thing was that I felt like a girl at that age, but it wasn't because anyone was telling me. It wasn't because anyone was putting anything on me. It was actually the opposite. It was the entire world, including my parents, telling me, you're a boy, you're a boy, you're a boy, and me still feeling that way. So it was not based on what my parents were instructing me on. So that's incredibly worrisome, in my opinion.
I think the problem is perfectly embodied in a situation like this, when you have a common sense position. Many viewers, regardless of political background, will be in unison that a mother should not force a child to transition against their will. But Blaire utilizes the case and pushes the narrative of the dangers that transgender extremities within the ideology will produce. Blaire's assertions appeal to mainstream audiences because the positions they're rooted in are moderate by nature. That's the catch. But she's validating this stance through a manufactured scenario. Sometimes she picked up the narrative from secondary sources, such as the "I'm a predator but it's okay because I'm trans," where she once again echoes many claims that this individual received early release from prison because of their gender identity, which was later contested.
I'm gonna read this headline to you. Convicted pedo to be released from jail after becoming a woman. No longer deemed a threat. We need to dissect this. So that person was sent to prison and is now being released, get this, because they are identifying and transitioning into a woman. Literally because, and I thought that can't be the reason. There has to be maybe like, I don't know, good behavior or an exoneration. No, this person still did what they did, but is getting released because they're on hormones and, according to the judge, no longer deemed a threat. So apparently the recommendation for Josie to be released was based on the fact that Josie is on hormones, estrogen, and apparently now doesn't have a high sex drive, and so they think it's a low risk future offender, and that they're confident Josie's not going to offend in the future.
Side note, I love how she states that parole isn't about the risk of reoffending 30 seconds after lamenting that this individual wasn't released for good behavior, which of course has nothing to do with the risk of reoffending. It's the same routine, moderate position. No one's going to agree that a person's sentence should be shortened just because of their gender identity, but on further investigation that appears to not be the case. However, it's that P word again that seems to not make a lot of people think twice. I'll defend Blaire on the front that a lot of the facts were only easily accessible after she had released the video. However, the same can't be said for her exposing games to a transgender person video, which includes her own interpretation of personally collated research.
Tiffany proclaimed on her social media that her child now, go figure, is trans, specifically non-binary, refers to them as a gentle them, which is so, like, that makes me want to do something very permanent to myself that I won't say because I'll get demonetized. There's photos of Tiffany painting the nails of this small child, which on its face is not bad. I don't think anything is wrong with pigment on someone's nails, boys or girls, but when you couple it with now trying to convince your child that they are also trans, that's an issue for me. People also messaged me with concerns over photos with Tiffany and Tiffany's boyfriend, someone out there for everyone apparently, wearing fetish collars around the sun, posting really weird photos of the sun laying in his crotch while he's wearing women's panties. Yeah. So all of that's really concerning, as well as a bunch of photos of Tiffany seemingly posing very seductively in bed with the kid, and like, you don't want to attribute something, you know, nefarious that isn't necessarily there. But when you couple it with all the other things, and the fetish collar and the weird picture where the kid is in between the lap in the women's panties, you know, it's just very suspect, and I'm not making any direct accusations here, but I think it's something worth looking at.
Now, there are many causes for concern when it comes to Tiffany's social media conduct and parenting skills that I would raise, but none of these explicitly prove what's denoted in the title. Hell, Blaire's own video seems to state this, but once again, the video's presentation of the word predator and ultimately inconclusive evidence of a person who I stress is with their child is a massive massive stretch. The use of the word predator is no longer just being used to play towards that mainstream audience. It's a word that provokes strong feelings and universal condemnation. No one wants to defend a predator, but how low are you willing to set the bar?
And I hope to God that things are not as bad as they seem to be just based on social media. But what we know about social media is that it's like the highlight reel of people's lives. So
a fair proportion of what Blaire presents as moderate has been first distorted to appeal to the moderate crowd, though a lot of the time it is unclear whether it has been distorted before Blaire has interpreted the content or not. Although Blaire has her biases, she may just be a bit susceptible to them. To say definitively that she's actively neglecting due diligence, you need a bit more solidified evidence that she was misrepresenting the content that she depicts on her channel, henceforth undermining so many of her precious narratives. And that wasn't exactly there yet.
Still one day left in 2019, and I feel like 2019 was no one's year. I feel like no one is making it out alive this year without some sort of cancellation, some sort of scandal, and I'm a little shook.
But it seemed that we were about to receive it. One of the points that many sympathetic to Blaire would draw from a fair proportion of her commentary is that even if you feel she's wrong time to time, that she was at least consistent to a fault, and that most of these issues that we've observed are yielded in a variety of political cliques due to a fairly basic application of confirmation bias. Her greatest failing was parroting misinformation rather than looking it up for herself. But this theory would be tested when a new situation arose, thanks to someone by the name of J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is a pretty famous novelist who shouldn't require much introduction, but she is primarily known for her authorship of the Harry Potter book series, an international best-selling saga of fantasy novels, which launched an equally successful set of films which has only manifested its fandom in the years following. On a more personal level, many regard them as a pretty integral part of their childhood and hold the works very close to their heart. However, in recent times, some have found themselves alienated by Rowling's divisive political nature. What sort of convictions were these? Well, you may be shocked to find they were related to gender. Yes, despite having socially liberal views on many issues, she began to attract disapproval from some online after expressing support for Maya Forstater, an individual who had lost an employment tribunal after her relationship with the business was discontinued due to statements the firm had deemed ill-suited for her position. At the time, it was implied that she had been sacked with immediate effect, and some headlines also understated the extent of Forstater's comments. But even with this information publicly available, Rowling didn't back down. White was also someone who advocated for Forstater at the time, and a few days later would make a video defending J.K. Rowling's comments.
J.K. Rowling is actually someone who has traditionally been referred to as very woke, someone who is very much favored by the type of people who go out and call everyone transphobic, so I was really curious as to why everyone was saying this. And apparently it's because of this tweet. "Dress however you please" is the first line. Not seeing any issues so far. I feel like that is very agreeable. Who disagrees with that? I don't really know. Call yourself whatever you like. Okay. We're choosing our names out here. Love it.
Now, as noted, there wouldn't necessarily be a huge issue with Rowling's tweet if its presupposition was correct. Most people took issue with the fact that she backed someone who many found held unsavory ideas that were unbefitting for a position, and the fact that the inference followed that certain gender identities were merely about how one dresses. Now, one thing that I will say is that there was a lot of misinformation on both sides that muddied the waters unnecessarily. However, the hearing in question did not rule against Forstater on the basis that she believed sex wasn't real. More on the fact that she was judged as believing that trans women were not women, and pronouns aside, she would not refer to them as such, even if they were recognized otherwise officially, and that her take on the matter was deemed absolutist, henceforth possibly yielding behavior that could be seen as hostile to the work environment. Maya's beliefs were repeated throughout the trial, even when explaining her misgendering of a non-binary person, continuing to misgender them, I'll add. Something else which Blaire harps on. In fact, managing to misgender this person as well.
Now, it's going around that Maya actually was on Twitter and misgendered a trans woman. And I'm gonna put that trans woman up on the screen, and I want you guys to tell me what pronoun you would probably naturally use for this individual. Right. Okay.
With all this said, you can still disagree with the ruling and think that she should be free to express those opinions on her social media without fear of reprimand. The judge does acknowledge that there are shades of grey in this case, and I think they can be observed when reading the court document. In fairness to Blaire, she recognises this, is critical towards Forstater, and expresses her opinion off the information available to her.
But I also will say, it's my opinion, that these are not beliefs that I think should warrant someone being fired for their job. I understand it's a private company and they can decide who has the values that align with themselves, and that's totally fine. I respect that, right? I respect the company's right 100%. But two things can be true at once. You can respect the company's right to hire and fire as they see fit, and also think it's kind of a lame reason for firing her, in my opinion. I personally don't think the jury is out on a lot of these issues that we're debating and talking about, and so I feel like we should be allowed to have them without fear of risking of losing our jobs.
At this time, she also takes a moment to affirm her stance on J.K. Rowling.
I do not think J.K. Rowling is transphobic. I think she's probably someone who is paying attention to this culture war happening on gender. And if we're just basing off of her tweet, I don't see anything transphobic in her tweet. That was a big reason, her simply stating that biological sex is real. And if we're getting to a point where we can't say that, girl.
And to be honest, maybe Rowling was misinformed, but that doesn't prove that she was outly transphobic. So Blaire concluding on this point was a safe bet, especially for her audience. However, as always, Blaire set a benchmark for her opinion, and that meant she was going to defend it pretty staunchly. However, this would be tested as Rowling's fiascos escalated. Essays were published, tweets were posted, heated interactions were shared, some of which certainly seemed questionable on the writer's front. However, Blaire maintained her stance, framing the author's outlook as mostly misunderstood by those who wanted to simplify it to one that could easily be classified as bigoted, without the nuance or respect it deserved.
Conservative and liberal, the world is definitely right now divided into people who can have a meaningful, nuanced conversation about sensitive issues and people who can't. That's it. That's the division I see these days. The conversation gets very muddied because people who are on the outside looking in at this whole fiasco happening, they really do think trans people are turning on J.K. Rowling and don't like J.K. Rowling anymore because they think J.K. Rowling is transphobic. But I want you guys, the next time you hear someone talking about how transphobic someone is, please pay attention to who is saying it. I think I know what transphobia looks like, and try as I might, and as many people are in my ear trying to tell me that J.K. Rowling was transphobic in these tweets, I'm not seeing it as a trans woman. And that's my genuine opinion.
However, Blaire's commitment to this standpoint would be tried once more when Rowling released a crime novel, directly spawning further allegations of transphobia, due to its portrayal of a character who doesn't conform to traditional gender roles as a sadistic predator. This was the rallying cry for Blaire to drop her hot take, so in typical form, she uploaded a video declaring she had read the book, and that people were once more overreacting to a simple detail. How could we doubt such an informed observer?
This time, everyone is up in arms about her new book being released called Troubled Blood. And just a heads up, I read the book. The concept of being a transvestite makes a very quick, brief, fleeting appearance in the book, and it's extremely unimportant. It comes in the form of one line in the book, one page in a 900-page book. And it's where the killer is described in one of the instances of him snatching a woman up as wearing a disguise of a wig and a woman's coat. That's it. I'm not kidding, that's it. That is everything to do that you could even remotely, if you really stretch your mind, sort of bring that to the idea of transgenderism.
Well, the first red flags come when you realize she is wrong. In fact, there are multiple pages that could be deemed troublesome in their content. But okay, maybe Blaire just missed other references. We all know she's not the most meticulous sometimes. Well, this becomes even more concerning when you realize that she was not even the first person to make this specific error. In fact, this incorrect assertion had been published in a Spectator article a few days prior and also spoken about on public interviews.
I want to read this excerpt from a review on The Spectator that I completely agree with. Let me put it like this. When you reach the last pages, the full absurdity of the statement that Rowling's moral seems to be never trust a man in a dress will be revealed.
Just going back to the book itself, from what I understand, it's simply just one line. And it's not even necessarily referring to the killer as a transvestite. I think it just mentions that the killer at one point wore a wig and a woman's coat. So that there is no trans rhetoric coming out of this book at all.
Then you combine this with the fact that she claimed to have read a 900-page book in the space of 12 hours, which although not impossible, seems even less likely to be the truth with the additional information available. It's like when two people sitting next to each other make the exact same mistake in a test. You kind of know that one of them is cheating.
Because coming from the perspective of someone who did read this book in the last 24 hours, there's no honest, genuine way you can link the two. I mean, honestly, anyone coming to the conclusion that this somehow demonizes transgender people is either lying or has not read the book. or is really, really nutty.
Some may have admired Blaire's readiness to defend Rowling against the, quote, woke brigade, but if she was prepared to falsely claim she had conducted research that she actually hadn't, with the intent to bestow herself with extra credibility, how trustworthy was she as a source and as a creator? And how many were beginning to take notice?
While I do believe that her book is extremely problematic, and before you even comment, like, did you even read it? Yes, I read the book. At least I read the first 10 chapters that were free. I was not about to pay this woman for her book. And honestly, the first 10 chapters are all you need to read to like determine that 1, Blaire's a liar, and 2, J.K. Rowling is a little like
Most of the excerpts I referenced in the previous part were derived from a video by trans YouTuber Samantha Lux, who made a video responding to Blaire, not just correcting the misinformation in her video, but also responding to a lot of the ensuing arguments that Blaire had averred.
Blaire demanded in her video that she is not a cross-dresser and she's not a transvestite. So to say that characters like Buffalo Bill or to say characters like Dennis Creed have any impact on her would be offensive. Girl. It is not only incorrect to say that, but it's wildly irresponsible. I'm not claiming that these movies or even J.K. Rowling's new book should be trashed or that you can't watch them or enjoy them. All I'm trying to say is that we need to be aware of the ways that representation of identities in media affect our perception of those identities.
It's a pretty solid response, and it certainly brought some previously wandering eyes firmly onto Miss White's questionable groundwork and rectitude. There had been doubts earlier on in the year related to her coverage of Davi Vanity, where she appeared to use the source material of another creator known as Tamimi while contorting the perspective to protect the infamous Jeffree Star.
Blaire White, the person who has gained over 500,000 subscribers for doing this, omitted information in her video and then lied about it. Oh, right, that's because she used some of my clips in her video, and I could tell this specifically from the music I've used, and also from the pictures that I personally edited out so that way my video wouldn't get buried in the algorithm. But in the first, 60 seconds, I want to say, of my Davi Vanity video, I put up screenshots where Jeffree Star says these tweets, and then I emphasize the date on it, and then right after there's another clip of him talking about going on tours and doing all this stuff with Davi and supporting him again and making a song, and then boom, there's the date on it again. And Blaire White had the audacity to omit that information. She clipped it out and made it seem like, wow, Jeffree Star is this hero for saying something about Davi Vanity, and never mentioned the fact that he had retracted his statements.
If you support that piece of shit, then unfollow me because you're supporting child. Davey is the lowest worthless scum I've ever met. When Jeffree Star tweeted what he tweeted about Davi being a pedophile, Jeffree worked with him afterwards, which shocked me. I thought it was, Jeffree worked with him and then tweeted that and then it was over.
What do you mean you didn't have all of the facts? They were right there, 20 seconds into the video of mine that you downloaded for your video. That's a lie, Blaire.
At the time, however, in spite of the pretty irrefutable evidence contributing to this pattern, this didn't seem to affect her reputation too much. Partly because the original video included this as a chapter rather than as a dedicated subject, and although a more popular video was also posted on the subject, some people struggled to follow it without the background information. Combine this with the fact that this was still a footnote in Blaire's greater video, and she was exposing someone rather reprehensible nonetheless, and most people appeared to let it slide. She would also appear to go against Jeffree Star in a later video, though some found it slightly convenient. It covers James Charles and another unnamed YouTuber, and it's a very uneasy upload to say the least, with Blaire mostly rambling, once again feeling like she was attempting to find a reason to publish a video with a snappy title, but ultimately culminating to very little.
What? You know what I'm saying? Like, if this is my first interaction with you and you feel comfortable enough to tell me this, thinking that I'm just gonna be in on this little game and complicit and he. No. That's something serious. And yes, it did take me a month to do this video, but that's because I have been scared. This is something serious. And I want to be very clear, this is not my place to out this person, the victim's name, because this is clearly their story to tell. But you guys have to understand the position I'm in. If I receive credible information that a very famous, very powerful YouTuber is a sexual molester or predator, but am I complicit with helping cover up for a predator by not saying that at least that much is true?
I have to say, I do find the tone in the video rather confusing, because although I think it's fair to call Jeffree out for his pathetic behavior, I was confused as to what trap Blaire was breaking out of exactly by going public with this information after it was already public. But I digress. What matters is that the J.K. Rowling video attracted attention towards Blaire's potential missteps, though once again, I think people were more focused on the present and it would likely phase out as it normally does, provided she didn't exacerbate the situation with greater blunders. But Blaire's errors were always pretty scattershot in their occurrence, so what were the chances that would happen? Well, maybe she tempted fate one too many times. And with that in mind, let's talk about trans athletes.
And there are plenty of female athletes that could absolutely wipe the floor with me. Female athletes in the comments, just comment what sport you want to beat me in because you can do it. Any of them, pick one.
Transgender athletes is another subject of interest on the Blaire White network, and it's not hard to see why, as it, like many other channel favorites, it pertains to gender identity and how it interacts with other social variables. It has similarly been the center of heated debate for a few years given the often gendered nature of sports and questions surrounding the suitability of individuals whose gender identity some feel could give them an unfair physical advantage against cisgender athletes. With this in mind, you can probably take a guess where Blaire stands.
Sports teams are segregated for biological reasons. Therefore, even for trans people, you have to take biology into account. And it should not just be based on identity. It should be based on their bodies and their puberty they went through. How early did they transition? How late did they transition? I think all of that matters.
Well, little surprise there, but up until September of 2020, she hadn't really been caught up in too much controversy, mostly holding her own within the discourse on the affair, partly accountable to the fact that there is still some ambiguity within the public sphere, even on the more liberal side of the political spectrum. Therefore, it must have seemed like a routine upload when she decided to criticize a transgender powerlifter for competing against women, despite the visible bodily superiority.
The bigger point is the idea, the concept of Janae competing against biological women is ludicrous. It's almost intentionally ignorant, and anyone who thinks that that is some sort of level playing field is a liar. I mean, the audacity of anyone to pretend or insist that there are no very obvious benefits that Janae, as someone who developed completely male well into her adulthood, would enjoy when competing against people who did not develop male is insanity.
She metaphorically tackles the person at the crux of this curious case, Janae Marie Kroc, and moves on. However, there was one little hitch.
And something we don't often see is that Janae actually went back post-transition and competing against men just because, I guess. Like, it was kind of like, she's gone back and forth competing with men and women based on I don't know what. I mean, that's just a dick move. No pun intended.
This was all fundamentally untrue. Yes, Kroc had long made the commitment to not compete against women, but okay, Blaire made a false assumption. This isn't new territory. Well, you see, the information that Kroc would not be competing against women under any circumstances was actually written in one of the posts that Blaire references. In fact, it's in the post that Blaire uses to push her point Janae Marie Kroc is competing against women. Up until that point in the video, although it had been implied, she'd mostly spoken about Kroc's involvement in women's competitions, as if it was a hypothetical. With this post, she solidified that assumption, when really, reading that post should have debunked it. Not soon after the upload, Kroc posts a comment on the video and a separate Instagram statement expressing her dismay at the misinformation being disseminated and the consequences it could have. This was also picked up pretty quickly by a fair few online, with creator Sam Collins uploading a response to Blaire around a week after, primarily covering this mishap alongside other prior incidents. In spite of this criticism though, Blaire did not respond. This was not out of the ordinary for her, she was used to being castigated by communities. This time though, the outrage didn't subside. In fact, as she appeared to provide people with radio silence, their annoyance only grew, demanding more accountability from someone of her size. As the videos and comments piled up, it became clear that this was something that had to be addressed, and in mid-October, 2 to 3 weeks after Janae's initial comment, the video was finally removed. At this point though, a mere retraction wouldn't suffice for many viewers. She had already caused excessive harm and that needed to be rectified, not just for her sake, but for the sake of the affected party. At the same time, as some began to take note of her other transgressions that had previously flown under the radar, the backlash began to augment in new ways, and some began to wonder how much Blaire had to apologize for.
So I want to be as clear and upfront in this video as I humanly can be, because I have essentially disabled myself from being as clear and upfront as I need to be.
Well, we were about to find out. Blaire released 2 apologies, a text version and a video copy, the text version coming on the 15th of October and the upload coming approximately a fortnight later. I assume this was because some had felt the Twitter format was not extensive enough in the audience that it would reach, because as themes go, neither diverged too much from the counterpart's core message. She made a mistake, a fundamental shortcoming in research. She never published it with the intent of deceiving anyone, and that since she had become conscious to these failings, and now has been taking these steps to resolve the situation with Shanae, transferring the AdSense money she had made from the video after it had been deleted. With that said, there are a couple curious observations that one can make on closer analysis. I've always found the "unlike many trans athletes" a rather strange comment. I'm not entirely sure what the intention of that interjection was, whether it was to shoehorn in a political point or to try and make sense of her misguided assumption. Regardless, there's no way Blaire would know how many trans athletes compete against cis athletes, or if it's a majority. But anyhow, the main issue is actually buying her response that she could have sincerely missed this information when it was readily available to her. But she at least admitted it was sloppy. In the text post, she announced a hiatus, which is formally concluded with her video. So she's clearly taken a bit of time to refine her thoughts and provide her viewers with a more lucid reflection in certain aspects.
In the background, I'm on a work trip and I'm doing my best to film with no light and just weird hotel vibes. So I want to be as clear and upfront in this video as I humanly can be, because I have essentially disabled myself from being as clear and upfront as I need to be in the recent weeks due to me going offline and not having any social media apps on my phone. But now that I'm logging back in, I'm seeing a sentiment of people who definitely want me to talk about this again, but this time in video form, and I actually want to as well, so I'm here to do that. 2 weeks ago, I posted a public apology to someone that I highlighted in a recent video of mine, which is now taken down. It was a video on trans athletes. In this video, I highlighted a couple different trans athletes, and I talked about upcoming legislature that's like relevant to the topic. But long story short, one of the trans athletes named Janae, I really fumbled her story. I got her all wrong. It is for no other reason than my own lack of due diligence and my own lack of sufficient research on her story that I said that. I genuinely did think it did not come from a deceptive place. I was under the misconception that she competes in both men and women's leagues. She corrected it and said actually just men's leagues. And to be frank, there is just no excuse for that kind of inaccuracy to be present in any of my videos, and I definitely never want it to happen again. I took the video down, and I also, once I got paid from YouTube just a couple days ago, I actually sent her the totality of the AdSense revenue that I accrued from that video.
She also explains her delayed response, yielding from her reputation as a bit of a renegade to many who chastised her, and how it influenced her perception of the criticism that she was receiving.
Also, I know that some people are critical of the delayed response I had when I apologized to Janae, and for that, I also have to say I'm sorry. I think the unfortunate thing is it took me a lot longer than it should have to differentiate between valid criticism and hate. And it wasn't the right thing to do, but I think that for a minute there I had my blinders on because I'm so used to sort of, you know, I do controversial topics on every video. So there's always people mad. And I think to a certain extent, I was almost just in this rhythm where like, post a video, people are mad. Post a video, people are mad. But this time, obviously people were mad for a valid reason, and it was always valid, and I should have recognized it even sooner.
However, her reflection appeared to have obscured her memory on other fronts, as her J.K. Rowling ebook had now become a physical copy.
Being a long, obnoxiously thick novel of J.K. Rowling's for research to doing such incredibly subpar research on the second video, but I did, and it was dumb, and I am sorry.
It was slightly ironic that this statement followed after a persistent contention that she would not lie intentionally, but I understand why she used this as an example to try and emphasize that this was an exception rather than a chronic issue with her content. But here's the problem, it does seem to be a chronic issue, and it couldn't be stressed more than in this scenario.
As just a learning opportunity to implement that in every area of my life, here and in my real life. I'm not infallible. I'm most definitely susceptible to getting things wrong, and it's really how you respond to it once you do get it wrong that makes all the difference, and I totally get that.
In the context of the video it's presented in, it's a reasonable response. We've all made mistakes. We've all made videos we regret in hindsight, content that we would have done differently, and for anyone to act holier than thou in such a situation is hardly justified. Unfortunately, with the information available on her previous actions that she had simply not addressed in the past, it became increasingly hard to fully trust her account, especially with the J.K. Rowling gaffe in mind. It would be easy to read this as her only choosing to respond when she actually faced consequences for her inaccuracies. She had lost over 20,000 subscribers subscribers by this point, and although such a sign may make you more conscious, many more cynical views felt like her hand had been forced to save her skin. At the time, though, many were simply not aware of this and welcomed her apology with open arms. She didn't necessarily need to make a video statement, so what she provided was a solid step up. However, not too long after, the tides once more began to turn, as the content of those critical of her began to accumulate. However, the fatal blow could be attributed to someone by the name of D'Angelo Wallace.
The J.K. Rowling book? How did she say she got it?
Overnight shipping a long, obnoxiously fake novel.
Overnight shipping? But I thought she said in her book review that...
I spent the last 12 hours reading it as an ebook.
So she didn't read it.
D'Angelo Wallace had been mostly known for making videos on subjects primarily involved in more tabloid drama up to this point. Pretty comprehensively, I'll add. Though I'm not going to stroke his ego too much as he's probably watching this video right now, so he knows what he does. His video on Blaire White served in part as a documenting of this pattern of behavior that we've discussed throughout this episode, but also took the time to respond to her admission video, pointing out what a more casual viewer may have missed, drawing unparalleled amounts of attention to an abundance of inconsistencies, causing many to flood the comment section of the videos with these observations and swing the like-dislike ratio in a much more unfavorable direction. Unfortunately, Blaire's apology really needed to be flawless to avoid being picked apart by many of those who had come out in force against her, and it just wasn't. It was made with a precision similar to the videos she was being called out for in the first place, and as more turned their ire towards her, Blaire's impassioned pleas were gradually being weathered away. However, it didn't stop there, because as D'Angelo Wallace's video came out very shortly after Blaire's response, its timing meant it served almost as a retort in itself. But Wallace nonetheless also took a great amount of time to tell his own story.
I used to be a huge Blaire White fan. I personally disagreed with her conservative opinions, but that was never what she really centered her content around when it comes to YouTube anyway. I mean, she is a writer for this conservative publication called The Post-Millennial, but as far as her videos go, she mostly just provides a perspective on things that happen that's alternative to the ones people typically run with, and I found that fascinating. What I'm trying to say here basically is like I was super transphobic when I was watching her content. I'm not saying like, oh, I was raised this way or I didn't know. I legitimately believed that trans people were irrational unless they were exactly like Blaire White. And that's insane.
His upload, spanning just over an hour, addresses his parasocial relationship with the creator in question and deconstructs her appeal as a supposedly transgender spokesperson for the community, ravaging the fabric of many of her principles and asserting that much of her content was built on belittling other trans people who didn't match up to her standards.
Here, or the one thing here. It's this entire pattern. And now when I think about the fact that she has gone after somebody like Janae Marie Kroc, who absolutely fits the description of being non-binary and says so, I'm nearly positive that Blaire White has done this on purpose, because it's what she's always done since 2016, is try to make these people look bad so Blaire can feel better.
This not just shifted focus towards the inconsistencies in Blaire's content, but also towards what many found in her, particularly those who may have placed her on a pedestal previously. Sure, she had always branded herself as problematic, but I think many still held her in higher regard than the light that a lot of these negative videos cast her in. Even the ethos of her predator exposés were brought into contention. All of a sudden, the significance of her apology video was dwarfed by something greater, the issue of whether her content had been tainted by the same toxicity that had been illuminated in this debacle. D'Angelo would argue so, but was that the entire story? Well, let's talk about it.
So I want to be as clear and upfront in this video as I can be as an activist who should disable
D'Angelo approached Blaire White from the perspective of a former viewer, and even supporter of Blaire, and this created a case that was very compelling in itself.
In part 2, I want to look at Blaire White's track record of mistakes and what they say about the kind of person that she is on YouTube. And I want to do this from the perspective of a former fan.
His video walked us through the process of realization, many of which he had only come to understand himself somewhat recently, being told with a harsh sense of self-reflection and consequently provoking the question for more conscientious audience members who may hold their creators to high account. The fact that he doesn't pull any punches against his own past self means that he does not need to compromise on his own presentation of Blaire.
I mentioned earlier that I used to be a pretty big fan of Blaire White, but when I stopped watching her, I didn't just unsubscribe. I stopped and questioned myself and had to evaluate why I was ever subscribed in the first place. I could claim that it was just because I wanted to hear the opinions of a trans person, but if anything has become clear by now, there are much better people on the platform who can speak up for their trans experiences.
But this personal connection within D'Angelo reached Blaire White viewers who themselves were prone to disillusionment, and as people began to experience this epiphany through the lens that Wallace presented, some decided to make known their dissatisfaction by using the only physically tangible method they have beyond likes and comments, taking up their qualms with the unsubscribe button. In the comment section, beyond the many expressing shock at some of Blaire's actions, others wrote to confess that they themselves had been won over by her rhetoric without considering it seriously. It seems that D'Angelo's message had effectively broken through. But why though? After all, much of what she was being called out for was hardly surprising, and the catalyst for all this hullabaloo was a research error that most would probably feel isn't worth crucifying someone over. Hell, it wouldn't necessarily change her viewpoint as long as there were grounds for it to still exist, which as noted, there was. And on her offensive content, well...
I know that casually saying the N-word with a hard R means you're definitely racist.
It's literally use the N-word with a hard R because they're angry at someone and they scream it at them.
I don't care, and I'll be super honest. I do that when I'm playing video games, or I do that if I stub my toe. I do that, so I don't really care.
You scream things out of anger, you scream the N-word hard R.
Sometimes.
Oh my god, okay.
I didn't see her address those in the Truth About My Racist Past video.
Go back a few years and you had one of the most prominent commentators on YouTube arguing that slurs were completely acceptable, and whether you like that or not, the truth is that it's not a deal breaker for a lot of audiences. So beyond this and D'Angelo's ability to relate feelings of responsibility to those watching, how did this video show Blaire up to the point where she was hemorrhaging subscribers faster than she was before?
I really do feel as though this is sort of a very simple, natural consequence of sort of the entirety of the trans community, their activists, and the wokies, as we call them, really plugging in their ears at every ounce of evidence that people are constantly trying to give them that, look, it's not about hating trans people, it's not about having horrible feelings towards them, it's literally just, this isn't fair. And it's obvious. Can you guys please address this? And they just don't.
Well, I think it comes back to the root theory, not just regarding her videos, but herself as a whole. She bases a lot of her assertive persona on the stances she takes and the fact that she has a grasp on them. She walked that balance of being the outspoken person who isn't afraid to say it as she sees it. But if that's not how she actually sees it, if her vision is that obfuscated, what grounds does she have to say it? How can you justify all the jibes and snarky comments without the grounds? At that point, you risk reducing yourself to an edgelord with no greater purpose than to stir the pot. People questioned how she could sincerely hold the beliefs if she wouldn't properly evidence them. On a more serious note, many felt with the misinformation that she purported, this could lead to false beliefs being held about marginalized groups that may drive bigotry and discrimination. This also compromises elements of her demeanor, because when you reverse the logic, you realize that everyone she has characterized as being unreasonable activists who hated her because she was spitting facts may have actually just been critics who were irked by the alleged mistruths propagated in her content, and her status as this pariah becomes much more apt. The shoe is on the other foot now.
I'm also highly aware that apologies, especially on the internet, are not just some magical fix-all of a situation, and that you really do have to pledge to just do better going forward, and I'm definitely giving each and every person watching this that pledge.
And what could Blaire say to this? Well, to be honest, it was a very rough predicament, given she had already admitted to making a mistake. Creators were free to draw their own conclusions from it if they were well evidenced. She could respond, but it would risk prolonging the turmoil that she was already going through, and possibly inflicting more losses onto herself. Unless she had some receipts to turn the situation on its head, it wasn't worth the hassle. So she moved on to calling out Amos Yee, who is completely deserving of being called out. Of course, she had to make the point that no one else was talking about it, other than these people of course, but that's just the clickbait game. The video itself is fine, but with that shadow still over her, it seemed that much of the momentum that she had was now against her, with a gross subscriber loss of over 70,000. Some may ponder if that is truly fair on someone who hasn't done anything of the scale and consequence of some that we have given airtime on this channel before, but at that point she had been charged with the crime of influenced.
In my opinion, Blaire White is the most irrational one out of them all, and it's not because she's transgender or for any reason other than the fact that she is a liar who wants to manipulate the emotions of the whole world into becoming evidence for something that she knows isn't true.
I'm not saying she was being persecuted here for having unbased opinions. It was a greater point claiming that she was either being unbelievably reckless with her platform or that she was just an outwardly bad actor, and that convinced many to withdraw their support. It was difficult to argue against it with the volume of evidence available, and I think the most disheartening fact was the revelation that very little had changed over the years which had passed, even if it was presented under a different guise. Blaire had gravitated from the outdated cliques and certain viewpoints of 2016 and the trouble they would often instigate, which was great. However, this ultimately worked against Blaire because whereas in past situations such as the Riley Dennis case, the behavior could be chalked up to certain communities and environmental factors causing a perception to be colored, it became apparent to many that these shenanigans transcended external variables. Even as she moved into the mainstream eye, she perpetuated a lot of these issues. Even as some had warned her and called her out, she had time to fix this, and ultimately it was a Blaire White problem, which is why she suffered to the extent she did, and why videos like D'Angelo's hit as hard as they did. As a matter of fact, many commentators had clearly cottoned onto this, because they were all choosing to come up with their own hypotheses for what personal motives drove Blaire to act in this way, latching onto the examples of invalidation to push another fairly common hypothesis we'd previously considered, the good transgender person.
I cannot even tell you the thousands of emails, thousands of comments that I got from people who had literally no understanding of trans people before that Jessica and Eve story, and when they saw my video calling it out and they realized that I'm trans calling it out, their perspective was changed 1000%. And suddenly they realized, I shouldn't have painted an entire community with that brush, and this girl seems normal, this girl's cool, and that was what happened. Like, no, there are normal trans people out there who don't believe all these radical things.
However, this only really addresses a personal philosophy that may drive certain aspects of her beliefs and risks overlooking the actual conduct that landed her in this jam in the first place. It's a jump that ignores a few steps, and I'd like to take a moment to step over them myself, because I do believe there was a bit of disparity in what people actually believed here. Do not fear, we'll cross the bridge of what Blaire's personal philosophy precipitates when we reach it. Beyond the fact that it is of course just theory, whether well backed up or not, I'm sure there are a few people who likely feel the way that Blaire does, yet for some reason they haven't ended up in the public quagmire for peddling misinformation on the internet. Blaming that solely on what Blaire believes seems somewhat insubstantial. Misinformation comes down to more fundamentally two explanations: negligence or malice, or both, maybe, who knows. Some may be inclined to say that this is a case of negligence. That's what Blaire herself said. As a matter of fact, she actually alludes to it in her video, making this bold claim in her defense.
While I know some people think this was intentional deception on my part, I can guarantee you this is not the case. Lying about something that the public can then go correct you on is only slightly more dumb than not doing enough research and coming to a false conclusion. And it was a really dumb moment on my part, and I'm not taking away from that, but I also would like it to be known that it was not malicious intent or something that was intentional.
Now, on paper, it's not like this doesn't hold water. It would be incredibly counterproductive for her to intentionally spout falsified content when she was already under scrutiny. There were other examples that would have been more appropriate, examples she had referenced in the past herself. To some, maybe Blaire's biases had finally conquered her. She went into the video with a perspective first and didn't pay mind to any information that would actually counter this, and could have easily prevented this faux pas. It wouldn't have been difficult to find a new subject and uphold her point of view, right? Well, I suppose it depends on what point you believe she's trying to make. This is where we can reintroduce the point that many were articulating, that she liked to make an example out of those trans people who didn't look like her, and in many ways, the upload in question was no exception.
Not making fun of her appearance. I mean, I think that obviously her appearance is outlandish, and I think that even she would admit that, because how could she not? But that's not the point. The bigger point is...
This was one of the comments that many had harped on when criticizing her. It felt like she was going after an individual on the basis that a person did not appear as orthodox as she did, and this is what motivated her to single out Janae. Was this enough for her to discount information that would serve to the contrary? Well, some would argue that as well, especially given only the video before many believed that she had lied about reading a book she never did, especially given it was a lie that she subsequently repeated in a video where she expressed remorse. If lying was easy, then how could we trust her intent on any other front? Well, the truth is that you can't, but does that definitively mean that it was an act of malice? You see, her comments about J.K. Rowling's book was definitely one to bolster her credibility, and likely views as well. It was daft and would justifiably prompt one to question the integrity of future comments about her tenacity. However, this is mostly a disposable comment, which although she shouldn't have made, also wouldn't have had the greatest implications whether she had actually read the book or not. In fact, if she had her facts straight, nobody would have any reason to disbelieve that she read the book, even if she didn't. It's easy to make an aside comment to try and outperform fellow commentators in the algorithm. That doesn't mean you're capable of knowingly twisting information about other people that could, in reality, be borderline defamatory. However, you could also respond to this by saying that Blaire had been called out for this behavior on a continuous basis. There are more than ample warning signs that her research was not sufficient and that she would regularly either dismiss this criticism or sweep it under the rug. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily expect her to address every individual mistake, when she wasn't the only person who fell foul to fake news. However, the fact that she clearly was aware of certain incidents and reacted to them, such as the drag queen one for example, should have been an indicator that she needed to tread more carefully, but it never felt like she did, and that made it much harder to defend her. However, the question still begged, what did Blaire really have to gain from being so intentionally dishonest? Well, I guess the obvious one would be clout from pandering to an audience's ideology. In the case of some creators, they'll find a niche, realize they're somewhat limited in their scope, and begin twisting or stretching stories to their audience tastes, even if that means not being completely transparent. There are some cases where it feels like Blaire did this, such as the Trump hat in Hollywood. However, by 2020, I wouldn't say that her audience had a collective credo, and she could have easily taken a more moderate standpoint and not been strung up. She'd done that before with the transgender bathroom issue and not been criticized. So it does point to something personal, and arguably possibly the most malicious explanation: the idea that Blaire was trying to indoctrinate her viewers, using content calling out predators to advance her moral standing, and then capitalizing on that with dangerously slanted opinion pieces based off dubious sources that she knew wasn't the case. This would indeed be a very ruinous portrait, and would certainly explain at least a fair majority of what we've discussed. However, it is also based on assumptions whose verity we can't be certain of. It goes on the pivotal assumption that Blaire knew she was lying in each of the stories, which although plausible is not the sole explanation.
Intimidate them. You can say a lot of things about me, and I know I'm messy. I'm a messy ass bitch. This is nothing new. Everyone who knows me knows it. Everyone who doesn't know me but hears about me knows it. It's true.
Many of Blaire White's videos emanated the high school goss energy, and Blaire's demeanor similarly matched that. She never appeared to be openly vitriolic towards anyone, but she constantly walked the line very precariously, blurring the boundaries between idle-minded errors and intentional manipulation. The failure to provide proper information and omit a lot of relevant facts appeared to be a result of laziness of research, and the fact that she based a lot of her material off other creators who were also heavily biased. She'd come in with her own preconceived narratives and not question the intent. Her controversies often showed her as being impulsive, petty, and in a way self-interested, but not really in a particularly calculated manner. To paraphrase Blaire a bit more unflatteringly, one would expect a person to be a bit smarter if they really wanted to take advantage of their audience in such a way. I'd say the greatest lie that Blaire has maintained is this idea that she is some high-research creator who is working behind the scenes, when really she's just a T-YouTuber who talks politics. With that said, there were other situations such as certain response videos where it became very hard to believe that she'd missed information, or cases where it seemed she was presenting slanted points of view. The fact that she leaves next to no references means that people can't fact-check her as easily, and may make one question why she does it. Maybe she knows her sources are a bit unreliable. More importantly though, this is why Blaire's biases have come to the forefront of her content in the first place. Otherwise, no one would really be able to challenge her opinions too deeply, provided they felt like they were properly derived from the actual observations that could be made. Too many times, her opinions led the videos rather than the subjects themselves, and that was a detriment to her and those that she spoke about. We know what these opinions are at this stage, but what can be said beyond that? Well, let's go there now. As said, I've never watched Blaire White routinely, but I know a fair few people who have, and one of the recurring comments that stopped them from watching her was the fact that her takes became predictable. This is never a good trait to attribute to a creator, but I think it's worse when you're dealing with information that is warped to suit your predictability. As the years passed and she became more mainstream, she may have changed, but not necessarily in a way that rectified the previous issues that she'd been called out for. As a matter of fact, you could harken back to one early video that clearly reflects her core views to this day.
So I think this meme pretty much sums up how I feel, but I will go into more detail. So yeah, I think all these identities are largely bullshit. I think they're super arbitrary. I think they're super meaningless. I think people who take them on are usually extremely boring and have nothing else to their personality other than I'm demi-queer, non-binary, genderfuck, special snowflake kin.
This mostly unsubstantiated idea that many of the people she railed against in certain scenarios were concocting their gender identities for attention. And you know, on the internet, sure, there are people who go to extreme measures in certain communities, but many of the people she would go on to subsequently make an example of were not people who she had any way of backing up such a claim other than her own prejudices. In her first ever upload during her brief anti-feminist phase, she talks about the differences between how men and women are treated in society. She does reference some evidence-based arguments, but as we noted, talks about her personal experience as well.
The term ladies first is definitely something that's actually implemented. It's not just a phrase. And while these are sort of frivolous examples, I do think there's something worth noting about the quality of life that women experience based on operating through a society that's just kinder to them, that's just more polite to them, that's just more welcoming of them.
It's curious because those she has most vitriol towards, in many ways, are the people who are already receiving a lot of stigma from the communities that surround them. And if you are to consider how society treats you on a personal level as a form of privilege, then many of the people that Blaire harangues are some of the most alienated in society. Whether that was the transgender women who struggled to pass, or non-binary people who identify in a way that is contrary to traditional gender roles. So to pose the question, why would these people act in ways that are attention-seeking if there is so little to prospectively gain? And who are we to say beyond a shadow of a doubt those are acting in such a way regardless, unless there is serious evidence to prove it? The other point that Blaire would regularly advocate is the one that she doesn't want to be thrown under an umbrella with certain individuals who may not have shared similar experiences that one would consider inclusive of what she feels constitutes as transgender.
What really gets me about that is that there are so many different letters in the LGBT acronym at this point. I think we all know it's basically the entire alphabet plus some numbers. So there's all these micro distinctions. This is this type of person. This is this type of person. This is this type of person. But yet for me saying, okay, I'm different than that is a problem.
She seems highly insecure about the fact that she may also have to share the spotlight with people who haven't gone through medical procedures, which I'm sure are highly distressing experiences, and I would never take that away from anyone. Nonetheless, anyone who's subjected to additional social stigma for not conforming to binaries like Blaire does is still another form of suffering. Most people would probably just like to live in peace away from that. When it comes to this issue, Blaire says it pretty succinctly herself.
And the goal of trans people is to operate within the binary, as in moving from one to the other.
She wants to exist within the gender binary, which is good. I'm happy for her. However, it feels like she's driven by this slippery slope argument that the transgender community and society as a whole will just evolve into this totalitarian civilization where everyone announces their pronouns before they initiate a conversation, and those who don't conform will be thrown into the gulag. An exaggeration, I'm aware, but she frames it as if many non-binary people are motivated to deconstructing the gender binary as we know it, despite the fact that many non-binary people also identify with traditional gender roles as well. This isn't just the case for non-binary people though, this is the problem with Blaire's rhetoric in general, and one that reared its head again with the Janae Marie Croc situation. That claim that some fabric of what we're used to is going to be lost. And hey, trying to preserve tradition is in part what makes her conservative, I understand that. However, it feels like Blaire's reaching for bogeymen to raise one's level of concern when a lot of the time a situation is more nuanced than it appears, watering it down with notions that she's long established but not necessarily thought to check if it's completely relevant to the point that she's making in the first place. Hell, in a video a few uploads after a big apology where she responds to a video with a person who identifies as a dog, she falls foul to this once more.
The only thing I know about this before watching it is that this is a trans man who is also a trans dog. If you think I'm saying this to make fun of this person, that is not the case. This is literally how this person describes themselves. A trans man who also identifies as a dog. 2020, what's good? Bella, look, it's your cousin.
The issue is that this person never said they identify as a dog, and a quick watch of the full video will show you that this is roleplay.
Pet play is any time that a person takes on the role of an animal, and they emulate that animal, either through their behavior or their actions.
However, it's put in the original video's title as a bit of clickbait, I suppose, and Blaire just runs with it without demonstrating any semblance of critical thinking and playing into the biases that she's been known to possess time and time again.
The identify as a dog thing. I identify as a man and also as a dog thing. Like, it makes a mockery of actual trans people, and y'all don't need me to even tell you that. Like, y'all know. This perfectly feeds into the millions of people on social media. Just search up the terms I identify as. It's like a big joke. Like, it's a joke. Like, I identify as a helicopter, I identify as this phone, I identify as this hairbrush. And it adds such an extra layer that the person is actually, you know, a trans man, supposedly. Like, why are you equating, like, why are you doing that? You're blurring lines that I would prefer not to be blurred.
And here's the thing, with this in mind, I do think that mainstream media mishandles trans issues in a way that may provoke some people to be defensive of their identity. I've never liked the idea of singular spokespeople for a whole community of extremely diverse individuals, and I do think a lot of them take advantage of the shock value that some may provoke, but you have to see through that. The greatest problem is that instead of merely calling out the coverage of a lot of this content on these failings, Blaire goes one step further and in a way contradicts herself. Now, she does call the mainstream media out sometimes, but then goes on to assume a lot of the stories as prototypical, often using them to denigrate other trans identities, whether she intends to or not. However, I think once you establish the fact that a lot of the time, the media and third-party sources can be highly unreliable narrators in representing your community, you have to consider how they may have changed the perception of a story and where the truth actually lies. Blaire makes this argument that, to put it quaintly, feels like she's frustrated that the attention on certain individuals begins to erase her own lived experience and warp this idea of what the community is really like. But her response is to try and undermine these people's identities, sometimes with the same points that are levied against her community in the first place. It's cruel and counterproductive. No community is going to represent identical experiences. No group of people is even going to share all of them together. We are different. And I don't think people in any community should need to compete for validation. Does that mean they're the same? Of course not. But does that mean that a person can't share a label that many believe to be inclusive anyway? Hell no. I don't think Blaire accomplishes anything by putting people down in such a way, and the fact that her points aren't well grounded makes her own biases even more blatant. Maybe there is more work to be done, but I don't think Blaire ever presented a solution, and I don't think she's changing. But what changes should be made? It's easy to sit here and point out the problems, but what's the solution? At the start of the video, when I stated that I was at least surprised that I found myself on lists alongside Blaire, I guess the shock wasn't just because of what I knew her previously for, but how I recognized that at best begrudged ambivalence many critics still held towards her, how she was still disliked by a lot of people. The issues were still prevalent, and I think it made her position more vulnerable given the number of those who looked to her for reasons other than her politics. I questioned a lot whether I should make this part in past or present tense, given the fact that a lot of it is obviously retrospective, and she has definitely mitigated some of her rhetoric. However, Blaire has continued to slip up in delivering information, at the time writing most recently with a story about a person by the name of Barbie Kardashian, who is worse than Jessica Yaniv. Nice little throwback reference there.
The star of today's video is someone by the name of Barbie Kardashian. Yes, this mugshot is real. This is not a creepypasta. And this story is probably the most disgusting and disturbing instances of a trans person being put into a women's prison. And I say trans person in quotations. You will see why this person is basically Jessica Yaniv on steroids. I would say on hormones, but that's not the case.
The video once again circulates information from very slanted websites and doesn't really address the actual situation, including this picture which lacks a source. After some reading, I'd say the allegations against the woman appear to be true, though they're taken from a report which keeps the original individual anonymous, but it adds up. The mugshot may be true because the Garda did release one to its officers, however one site just said they obtained it and no one questioned it. However, Blaire, once again falling foul to the pseudo-common sense position, implies that her take on this matter is the moderate one.
I think there are problems with both ends of the extreme, and so I'm gonna offer some solutions in this video that are outside of that. I know a lot of people, maybe even that are watching this video, are more comfortable with keeping it simple in their minds, which, you know, biological sex you're born as, that's what prison you go to. And then other people are going to be more on the extreme of, if this person says they're a woman, put them in the women's prison. But these sort of absolutist, extremist positions are what gets us into 99% of the messes we get into in all areas of when it comes to trans people. For example, me, bitch, in their right mind, who would think that if, God forbid, y'all caught me slipping and convicted me of some kind of crime, that I would be best placed into a men's prison.
Of course, Blaire, we should have an independent board which assesses when people are woman enough to be permitted to women's prisons. Genius. Here's the thing, and in my humble opinion, in part a reason for why so many people in the past took to Blaire. I don't think our philosophy is one that is completely alien, particularly in 2016. Born out of a frustration at certain institutions, individuals, and their somewhat obnoxious doctrines, you see the antics and it causes a gut reaction. A lot of people felt it back then, and some still feel it today, especially when they feel like they're on the receiving end of it. There definitely are people out there who make unreasonable demands of those around them, some who are far too hostile and unpleasant in trying to pursue their causes, and others who I think are too sensitive and far too overreaching in what they try to police. Righteousness doesn't always make you right, and I'll be the first to say that. I think the issue is that even to this day, a lot of us tend to base our beliefs as a reaction to the environment around us, rather than the bigger picture.
Okay. Well, ask him.
Give him a check and we're shutting this event down now. If you do not listen to her, your event will be shut down right now. Right now. Your decision. Make a decision now.
We are going to let you on the mic. Okay. All right, so we are trying to be reasonable. We are trying to be reasonable. We are trying to be reasonable.
We are reasonable.
We are trying. We're gonna let you on the mic. We are gonna give you the mic. We will, after Senator Sanders. After Senator Sanders. After Senator Sanders. After Senator Sanders. After Senator Sanders.
Do not tell me what to do.
Senator Sanders.
Sit down.
Back then, given how someone documented to have been behaving, it made Blaire's existence as a creator easier to justify, and consequently normalized a lot of the actions that we now reflect on with distaste. However, over the years, for a lot of people, it's been about understanding that actually, even if the previous criticisms leveled towards certain individuals may be valid, it doesn't mandate complete opposition to them or their ideology. In the case of Blaire, this sense of closure seems to have been replaced with a greater and greater straw man of what these people may collectively want and why it's wrong, despite the fact that there isn't necessarily a clear consensus that could easily define their interest beyond acceptance. This then leads to certain sweeping statements and comments which may as well be from those on the other side of the aisle. I've been there before, trying to fight the middle ground because you see people who claim to speak for your interests who don't even want to consider your own opinion as a member of that group. But at the same time, arguing for the contrary without the conscious recognition of that can be just as destructive. I remember uploading a video myself towards the end of 2017 on Riley Dennis when I was in that genre, which would be chronologically after Blaire had apologized to Riley. And even though I expressed my many disagreements with her, the most backlash I received was for actually addressing her as a woman. For many in that genre, the damage had already been done, and I think there's a point where you have to recognize that when you position yourself against people, you're just playing into the division that you seem so driven to resolve. Blaire appeared to have that realization herself, but then just regressed back to it, just for a different set of people. In a way, she hasn't changed. She just goes after people who are indisputably terrible and uses it to indirectly demean their trans identity instead. And sometimes she just doesn't even go after people who are terrible anyway. In 2020, the year where I think everyone was just about tired of smoke and mirrors, the extremes we were being driven to, Blaire may have been looked towards as a saving grace, but I think it ultimately led to her position being unraveled because people had enough. Those who didn't believe her position as the creator standing up for common sense was legitimate. Common sense isn't built on one sense of centrism or compromise, it's built on a philosophy that values information, research, and rigorous discourse, whether that leads to positions that are left or right wing. And that's the thing, anyone could go over Blaire's videos, pick apart every time she's wrong, every time she's been reckless or irresponsible, reprimand her, but that wouldn't make you better than her. And it certainly doesn't make me better than her. Everyone f***s up. The difference is that Blaire's problem is one that fundamentally underlines her career on YouTube, her own philosophy, which is continuously laid more and more bare every time she makes the exact same mistakes.
It's not a popular opinion, it's not a politically correct opinion, but I've never been one for political correctness, so yeah.
Back when she started, you could see the potential for the creator that she is today. Her channel always felt like a very personal venture, with many videos definitely discussing her experiences and stories. However, there were also prevalent flaws which showed her nature to jump to conclusions, and points that felt strained to prove a greater thesis which wasn't always there. At the same time, there were definitely reasons to think she could alleviate these. She used some references here and there, seemed quite open to discussion, and was definitely part of a greater community which could be partially accountable for the atmosphere that bred certain behaviors. Yet, that just hasn't happened. In a way, Blaire White is the only YouTuber I've come across who uses less references in her videos now than when she started, despite the fact that I'd argue it's more important than any time before. Calling out people for heinous actions gives you a greater imperative to justify it, whether other people assume it to be true or not, whether it has been established.
Also, it's really not missed on me that in recent years, it seems like a really cheap, easy way to get a lot of media attention for celebrities to come out as they, them, and non-binary and trans and all that. And of course, it's very convenient to come out as a they, them because you don't have to actually commit to any sort of transition. Courtney Stodden, Sam Smith, the guy from Queer Eye whose name I can't remember, the one who looks like Jesus, the actor we talked about earlier with Tree and Tree Self, and literally just so many more I can't even think of. And I'm not saying every single one of them is disingenuine, but like, it's a little too convenient that it's just one after another, after another, after another, when you know that if this was 2014 or 2013, before this was even a trend, they would not be coming out.
Given the fact that the only real influential variable that has remained consistent is that personal sentiment she appears to possess, many people feel that she is attempting to separate herself in a way to obtain acceptance from those who may be more skeptical of certain identities. If that's how she personally feels, then I can't take that away from her, but it's not how you run a channel that claims to be bridging the divide, given how much her personal sentiments surface in those videos. I don't think society is a negotiation table where you bargain who's going to be accepted to satisfy the most individuals. In the grand scheme of things, that's not moderation to me, it's appeasement. Moderation isn't only about what opinions you have, though it does influence it. It is a state of mind, and on too many occasions, Blaire failed to exercise it. I wouldn't care if you were a conservative, liberal, or progressive, that stands independently to me. That duty couldn't be more valuable, as Blaire had shoehorned herself into the mainstream. People wanted that recognition of nuance, that attention to detail, the moral obligation. But they didn't find it, because Blaire's opinions often didn't extend in a way that went beyond countercultural conservatism. That whole counterculture position never felt like it had too many beliefs to stand on its own merit, and you can only be against so many people before those around you wonder what you're really for. If you don't back up your positions, then what reason do people have to trust you over those you paint as the extremists, some of whom hardly have the most extreme views? If Blaire wants to give us moderation, she has to represent the other side rather than just her response to assumed absolutists.
There is a discussion about trans people included or excluded from it, and what is the right way to navigate, right? And my friend and I both agree that the trans community as it stands now will never achieve full acceptance, and how we've almost noticed an uptick in like anti-trans people and almost like a resurgence of people who like straight up don't like trans people, don't get it, are very turned off by the community and by trans ideology, and then actually lash out at us like in an anti-trans way.
As many other creators have already observed, there are other individuals who cover a variety of trans issues in a balanced and detailed way, and in much more depth, some of whom have gone to lengths in the past to correct some of Blaire's shortcomings. I don't think this means that Blaire's perhaps lightweight content should be banished from the platform, but I think it also has to be done with perspective for what it represents, and at least with an active effort to distinguish what points should be drawn from such an upload. Otherwise, people give it too much consequence in what it could say about communities, and she needs to be more mindful when dealing with the topics that do carry that substance. Blaire needs to be more sensitive on that front, whether she wants to retain that nonchalant, brazen attitude or not. She's still a creator who takes themselves seriously enough to make videos about online scoundrels alongside some pretty strong words. These things have consequence.
But sometimes things just cross a line, and on several occasions, I crossed a line, and I'm sorry.
We've all learned the hard way, but we own it and we work out how to improve. Yet over the years, the changes to Blaire's channel feel cosmetic, made to present the feeling of progression, some apologies, some alleged reconciliation, but you strip away the makeup and it's the same foundation that it was before. And as the internet changed, those flaws became clear. Makeup is temporary, what's underneath is permanent. And I'll make this clear, I think Blaire is far from the worst political creator on YouTube, but she suffered the most because she played the riskiest game. Her audience held her in very high regard. She appealed to those in the mainstream, some of whom very conscious of their ideas, and still piled straw onto the beleaguered camel. A part of me believes that she does hold her beliefs close to her heart, because as she said herself, much of her failure to present solid information isn't the best option, but she continues to do it. Yet a connection to a bygone era that may be worth letting go. Through old friends and new enemies and the incessant drama, time may have passed, but she remains ever present. And as she does, I hope she pays these thoughts some consideration. The world is changing, and as we move towards 2022, it should be clear that moderation needs to be more than just a buzzword. It needs to be backed up. You can't just play both teams or expect your character will be defined off the back of who you call out alone. Blaire set a higher bar than she could obtain and ultimately paid the price for it. Whether she'll continue to do so will depend on how she goes forward. I just hope she doesn't go back. Thank you. So that was the video, and a big thank you as always, a very, very long one, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I want to give big thanks to the editors who have done a fantastic job. I'll be putting all their links in the pinned comment, so be sure to check them out if you liked what they did. Big shout out to Logan as always, post-editing, tight as ever, great work. Thanks to Lanuski for the music and Starfo for the thumbnail. Just great work all round, and I really appreciate everyone who helped out, who watched the video, who gave me their feedback before the release. So thank you so much. I also want to give thanks to the artists. They'll be in the pinned comment as well. And of course, the lovely low patrons, the $10 patrons who will be shown on screen right now. But also a special thanks to my $50 patrons, Hypercube, Goth Cream Puff, Catears.jpg, and Esther Badoya. What a great set of names we have there. And also a very special thanks to my $100 patrons, Marlo and Kiel Lomaland. I'm not entirely sure how I pronounce that, but you can always message me and give me feedback on that one, Keel. Otherwise, my social medias, I don't really use them, but they're there. And of course, the references will be at the bottom of the pinned comment as well, in case you want to check out the links for yourself. Big thanks again to everyone who's helped out. Much love to everyone who's supported me. I know uploads have been a bit slow, but hopefully they can return to a decent pace soon. Though I doubt this will be the last slightly contentious topic that I'll be covering. So get ready for some vigorous debate at least. I don't really have too much else to say, so I'll wrap it up there. Thank you again all for your support on this monster of a video. If you made it to this part where I just talk randomly, thank you everyone. Take care. I'm The Right Opinion, and I will see you in the next one.